Okay, so thank you everybody for coming to this second teach-in in a trilogy. So I guess I'll start, and I just wanted to say that feel free to jump in the whole time, ask as many questions, argue, debate, whatever you want, just any comments that you might have on this. This kind of came to my mind after I did the first teach-in on capital. Then I realized that I had to talk about what became of capital and how it was received and what that might suggest today about kind of recovering the point, the kind of essence of it, rather than turning it into an economic. So I'll begin. In my first teach-in, I made the case that what has fallen out of the treatment of Marx's Capital was its relation to the proletarian socialist movement. This is not necessarily a thought mistake, but rather reflects the lack of the object of critique in the present. Consequently, while people can understand the mechanistic aspect of the text, so they can explain this is how the system works, blah, 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 the purpose drops out. Given that Marx published only volume 1 during his lifetime, it is worth considering how exactly capital is used in the belle epoque of the proletarian socialist movement, the Second International. The standard account of the Second International is that they really didn't understand Das Kapital. This is partly due to Lenin's remark that, quote, it is impossible to fully grasp Marx's Capital, and especially its first chapter, if you have not studied through and understood the whole of Hegel's logic. Consequently, none of the Marxists for the past half-century have understood Marx. Raya Dunyaskayeva, for example, claims that up until World War I, unfortunately no one had standard the, quote, interpretation of Marxist economics and philosophy provided by Kautsky, Plekhanov, and Hilferding. Similarly, Michael Roberts said in an interview that the leaders of the Second International never really read volumes 2 and 3 of Das Kapital, and, quote, ignored or dismissed a theory of crisis based on the law of the tendency for the rate of profit to fall. So this was an interview we had in the Platypus Review, and so I'll just quote this quickly. Roberts said, but the revolutionary socialist leadership of the Second International had not really read volumes 2 or 3, one of the big exceptions being, of course, Luxemburg. She tried to argue against Kautsky and Bernstein, who were saying that crises were going to happen in capitalism. Were not going to happen. But nobody really got to the heart of why there are crises in the advanced capitalist world based on the law of the tendency of the rate of profit to fall. This law was generally ignored or dismissed by the leading members of the Second International at the time. Okay, so this is an interview that we had. This is rather curious, considering that Kautsky had a hand in helping Engels with volume 3 and edited the theories of surplus value after Engels' death. Engels, for example, thanked Kautsky for finding a spelling error in Marx's manuscripts and carried on a correspondence with Kautsky about whether or not a comma should be included in one of the passages in the posthumous publications of Das Kapital. Moishe Postone, who we read in the Platypus Reading Group, summarizes, in my opinion, kind of the general conception of Karl Kautsky, or what he calls traditional Marxism. Quote, by traditional Marxism, this is Moishe Postone, do not mean a specific historical tendency in Marxism, such as orthodox Second International Marxism, for example, but more generally all analyses that understand capitalism, its basic social relations, essentially in terms of class relations structured by a market economy and private ownership and control of the means of production, and grasps its relations of domination primarily in terms of class domination and exploitation. Within this general interpretive framework, capitalism is characterized by a historical dynamic driven by class conflict, capitalist competition, or technological development, which gives rise to a growing structural contradiction between society's basic social relations, interpreted as private property in the market, and the forces of production, interpreted as the industrial mode of producing. When capitalism's contradiction is grasped in such terms, its possible historical overcoming is understood implicitly or explicitly in terms of collective ownership of the means of production and economic planning in an industrialized context. That is, in terms of a just and consciously regulated mode of distribution that is adequate to industrial production. At the heart of this theory, so this is Postone continuing, is a trans-historical and commonsensical understanding of labor as an activity mediating humans in nature that transforms matter in a goal-directed manner and is a condition of social life. Labor, so understood, is posited as the source of all wealth in all societies and as that which underlies processes of social constitution. it constitutes what is universal and truly social. So just to step back for a second, Moshe Postone basically says the problem with traditional Marxism, this is his view, is that they kind of affirm labor, and so consequently they end up justifying capitalism. So they end up kind of ignoring or dismissing the possibility of emancipation from labor, right? Or emancipation from work, different ways in which it could be put, right? And so it's kind of his way of understanding what happens in the 20th century is that they get capital wrong. They don't get that it's a critique, it's a critique of labor in that sense. Okay. In other words, the traditional Marxism as taught by the leaders of the Second International set up the workers to manage capitalism by misdirecting them towards the problem of distribution. So if you remember, I've read the essay with a few of you, he says, well, it's not really about distribution, it's about production, right? So you can change the property around and still have capitalism. Here's where I come in, okay. But Postone reveals his concern too clearly. Karl Kautsky, in the most popular text of the Second International, The Class Struggle, wrote, quote, "It is not the freedom of labor, but the freedom from labor, which in a socialist society the use of machinery makes increasingly possible, that will bring to mankind freedom of life, freedom for artistic and intellectual activity, freedom for the noblest enjoyment." In other words, it's just wrong, right? It's the most well-read text in the Second International just directly said, of course the point is to abolish bourgeois social relations. Of course the point is to abolish labor, to overcome it, to emancipate people for their full becoming. That was always the case. And yet in the mid-20th century for Postone, and we kind of deal with this in our reading group, it couldn't look like that for him. Okay, so I want to argue the following. The betrayal by the leaders of the Second International, linked to the failure of Marxism in the 20th century, has led leftists to approach Marxists like Karl Kautsky as a priori wrong. Everyone becomes a plumber. Where is the leak? Where is the wrong turn? It should be noted that despite their split, Lenin in his Granite Encyclopedia entry on Karl Marx recommended Kautsky's writings on Marx's economic doctrine. He called the class struggle, which I just quoted, and the economic doctrines of Karl Marx, quote, outstanding. And this latter text was still used in the Soviet Union up until 1931, right? So Lenin himself obviously splits with Kautsky, and I'll talk about this in the next teaching, over the war, but he's not like, oh, Karl Kautsky doesn't understand Das Kapital. And yet, you know, it's kind of a common theme to approach it like such. The problem was not that Kautsky, Plekhanov, Babel, and Bernstein didn't know the point was to abolish labor, to transform the mode of production, or didn't understand Das Kapital, but they had adapted to the imminent forms of struggle of the proletarian socialist movement. In other words, they betrayed the purpose of Das Kapital that they once channeled. They failed to consciously apply the principle that they grasped well above previous history to the subsequent development of the Second International. They made a mistake that has ironically been repeated by their critics. They reified the text. By treating the text as the laws of the system of production, they were unable to deal with the sharp turns in what really is a contradictory mode of production. As George Lukács recalled later, because the opportunists, he's referring to Bernstein and Kautsky here, operated with unhistorical, timeless criteria of the laws of nature, they were bent on examining a capitalism as such, a crisis as such, and so on. Consequently, they were totally unable to grasp historically new phenomena, such as imperialism. Right? This has been in the news today. In other words, they kind of were reified based on what that was, in all its essential novelty. I'm going to leave that aside for right now, because the Second International application of Das Kapital was not only adequate to the movement of that time, at least in the period that I'm going to discuss, but has high moments of brilliance that have fallen out. Das Kapital was primarily for the people of the Second International an exposition of the materialist conception of history. So this is what I'm going to frame this teaching on. Just any thoughts so far before I'm jumping in?
On the left's tendency to interpret Kautsky, Plekhanov, etc., as plumbers. So I know that we've talked about before, like social democracy or like the left in general today, they can express sort of like a even sub-Kautskyan view of Marxism. So how does that like reproach with this sort of? Where's that critique?
What I'm trying to say, the reason I quote the Dunya Skype at the beginning is she's like, oh, what's the problem? He didn't know capital.
Right.
Done, right? Like, it's like the easy way of solving the problem is like, they didn't really understand the text, I get the text.
Right.
It's done in that sense. And so like a plumber, you know, if you have a problem in your house and a plumber comes over, they're like, that's where the leak is. Done. And so I'm rather trying to say that we have to treat Marxism as a historical phenomenon. And so Karl Kautsky could have been correct on it, and there was essentially new phenomena that actually split the Marxist movement. And I'll kind of discuss this more in the second teaching, but in order to, I mean the third one, but in order to get at that, I have to show the way in which Karl Kautsky was applying capital at the time. Do you have a question?
Okay, no, I was just saying.
All right, so how they applied it as a conception of history, not really in economics. Okay, what did the materialist conception of history mean to the leaders of the Second International? John Picard, writing for the IMT on Karl Kautsky's text, Foundations of Christianity, explains that contrary to the religious account of Christianity, quote, for Marxists who based themselves on the real material world, there was a completely different reality. Picard explains that Karl Kautsky rejected the metaphysical myths behind Christianity, the miracles, supernatural events, and so on, and attempted to describe its origins and rise to the social conditions that existed in the Roman Empire. The common conception of Marxism is expressed quite clearly here. Religion is part of the superstructure, and the origin, not necessarily complete determinism, but the origin of the religious movement was founded in the social conditions that existed during the declension of the Roman Empire. It would seem that what separates Marxism from idealism was to focus on, as Picard says, the real material world, right? In other words, Marxism is about the real world and it's not about ideas or something. And the primacy of the social and material conditions that give rise to certain ideas. But this would not separate Marxism from a very common idea in the Enlightenment. So to give some background, there's a very famous dictum by the idealist Bishop Berkeley: to be is to be perceived. To say anything else would be question begging, asking how one can know something that is not perceived by anyone. Berkeley ascribed this faculty of perceiving to God. This was met with by a sly retort by the encyclopedist Denis Diderot. Diderot asked his friend Jean de Lambert, what is an egg except for an unperceiving mass, which could develop into a baby chick that had sensation, life, memory, consciousness, passion, and thought? Such a view was common of the French materialism of the 18th century. Consciousness emerged from nature. Quote, the bird is of flesh, the musician of flesh, differently organized. But both of them have the same origin, the same formation, the same functions, and the same end. But this only raised an aporia. Where does free will come from? Diderot was friends with Jean-Jacques Rousseau. Rousseau rejected this brand of materialism as fatalistic. Rousseau agreed that both humans and animals come from the same source, but, quote, with this difference that in the operations of the brute, this is animals, nature is the sole agent, whereas man has some share in his own operations, in his character as a free agent. As Hegel would put it, just for the reason that man knows himself to be an animal, he ceases to be animal, and as mind attains to self-knowledge. So the mere fact that we ask, what is man? You're already out of the animal world. That's the point, he will say. It was insufficient to merely say that the finch and man was the same, even if consciousness did emerge from nature, because man reflects on his instincts, can know them, and change them. Diderot was correct to point out that the faculties are found in nature, but the question is, how do they develop? How do they become free? Sort of self-movement, as Kautsky puts it. Rousseau found in society the answer to the dialectic of freedom and necessity. Quote, he who dares to undertake the making of the people's institutions ought to feel himself capable, so to speak, of changing human nature, of transforming each individual who is by himself a complete and solitary whole into part of a greater whole, from which he is in a manner receives his life and being, of altering man's constitution for the purpose of strengthening it, and of substituting a partial and moral existence for the physical and independent existence nature has conferred on us all. He must, in a word, take away from man his own resources and give him instead new ones alien to him, and incapable of being made use of without the help of other men. Marx would later write, in On the Jewish Question, that only when, quote, the real individual man reabsorbs in himself the abstract man, and recognizes those alien resources as his own, will humans be emancipated? But I'll come back to that. It's a kind of early essay by Marx. Rousseau had noted that the idea of the state of nature, which was there in John Locke and Thomas Hobbes, while it maybe never actually existed, served to, quote, explain the nature of things. It was a dialectical category, necessitated by reason investigating its own source. How do you grasp the origin of reason from within itself, from the product of this development? You can see Diderot and Berkeley falling to either side of the question. Right? In other words, Berkeley's emphasizing the perception, Diderot's emphasizing the development, and Rousseau's treating this as a dialectical category. Right? This is why the modern dialectic kind of emerges in Rousseau's essay, The Discourse of Inequality. So, quote, this is Hegel, "Spirit has for us nature as its presupposition, of which it is truth." So spirit is the becoming of nature, right? Humans are self-conscious nature. But the revelation of the spirit, which is free, is the positing of nature as the world, meaning nature comes into its own the second we go, like I am, right? This nature is posited against that. Spirit and nature, freedom and necessity, were dialectically interrelated. Homo sapiens, through the instinct of adaptation, of mimicry, functions found in all animals, had turned themselves into humans. And there's a great quote by Walter Benjamin. Men as a species completed their development thousands of years ago, but mankind as a species is just beginning this, right? So I have the same biological functions as, 10,000 years ago, 20,000 years ago. But humans, humanity, mankind, that's a modern thing. That's emerged from nature. It's found in civilization. Okay. Even speculative thinking was a social power. It wasn't just something that had come about after men had produced the opportunity for leisure, as Aristotle suggested. The very possibility of abstract thinking, a power developed out of social intercourse, language, required the preceding development of society. Philosophy presupposes society. Such freedom was only possible in society, for while animals were slaves to their instincts, society objectified the species life of humans and allowed them to reflect on human nature. Right? So Marx will say human nature, society. That's why we can change it. And by the way, there's this kind of joke on the internet, capitalism is human nature. So we could all say, yes, that's why we can change it, right? Which is not what's meant by the meme, but yeah. Immanuel Kant well understood what Rousseau had shown. Rousseau, Kant said, proceeds synthetically and starts from a natural human being. I proceed analytically and start from the civilized one, meaning Kant saying I'm going from what Rousseau has already shown in his critiques. Both Kant and Adam Smith gave the same example of philosopher and porters as products of the division of labor. So Adam Smith has this story of like two children who are friends, a porter and a philosopher. As children, there's no difference, but they grow up and they go into different functions, right? And Kant gives a kind of similar story in his lecture on ethics. The social institutions that arose, or at least that ought to arise, none of the bourgeois thinkers were ever affirming the existing society. They were saying this is how things ought to be. Then were those that were the rational expression of the self-consciousness of society, rational as in universal and comprehensible. Everything that I have said up until here still falls into what would be called an idealist conception of history. Right? Even though Kant, Rousseau, they all talked about tools, they talked about material things, including even the explanation of the political institutions by civil society. As a cause of civil society. The materialist conception of history must be understood through this approach, but with an important twist. In the Hegelian philosophy of history, progress in history means progress in self-consciousness of spirit, of society, of which each individual is a member and thus a part of the self-consciousness of spirit. Consciousness works behind the back of self-consciousness, creating a new object that only becomes explicit for consciousness when it is theoretically grasped. In other words, the new potential for freedom goes beyond the current actualization and requires an active subject to grasp the higher form. There is already a kind of, quote, post festum, this is a Marx term, with Hegel. It was not duration or even succession that made history. So it wasn't time, it was rather stages of self-consciousness. But most importantly, Hegel's philosophy of history, and very reasonably so, expressed a faith in society. It was possible for people to forget things and for the world to regress in time, but the self-consciousness of freedom, once it was articulated, that was there, right? It had kind of accomplished the form. The materialist dialectic, to quote Lukács, gives us a twist. Do you have a question? Okay. All of the Hegelian dialectic still remains the same in a certain sense with Marx and Engels, but it is slightly modified to express the problem with the bourgeois dialectic. As George Plekhanov, so this is one of the teachers of Lenin, he's one of the founders of the RSDLP, points out, Marx and Engels are usually wrongly characterized as explaining political institutions and superstructural theories by economic interests. Quote, if economic materialism denoted a theory that recognized property interest as the main driving force in historical progress, then the French historians of the Restoration period may well be called economic materialists, meaning it's a standard bourgeois idea to say, well, the rich people have interest of rich people, workers have interest. This has always been there. It's always, I mean, Adam Smith talks about it, right, in The Wealth of Nations. Benjamin Franklin, as a good bourgeois figure, describes man as the tool-making animal, right? It's pretty materialist. And Kant and Rousseau, Kant, Idea for Universal History from a Cosmopolitan Intent, Rousseau, and basically everything he writes, they talk about us as creating our nature through the tools we make, the world we live in, the world that we produce. So that was always there. But Marx and Engels explained, quote, development of those property interests to the development of the productive relations caused by the growth of the productive forces. So this is where I feel sometimes things get tricky. This was a very clever way of flipping a history of freedom into a history of an unfree form of freedom. Right? So capital is an unfree form of freedom. It is an expression of the human species, but we experience it in an unfree way and it comes to dominate us. Could the growth of the forces of production actually be a means of blocking their conscious grasp? Indeed, such a conception of history as the growth of productive forces could not be made until the modern era. Karl Kautsky describes the ancient Roman world as a backward step rather than a forward step because it destroyed the productive forces of humanity, meaning the enslaving of people destroyed the productivity of labor, and it fell below the preceding civilizations in that sense. So it was like the opposite of something economic. This also explains for Kautsky why the Catholic Church ends up dominating the invading, quote, morally and physically superior Germanic people, because the latter took over the superior Roman mode of production that was preserved by the church. So the church kind of preserved the agricultural kind of mode of production. And so while the barbarians invaded Rome and conquered them, they could only conquer them in a kind of like military sense, but they were adapted to, the church basically preserved a higher mode of production, at least, and I'll talk about kind of what this means later in that sense, right? Whereas, actually, let me keep going. This differs from Hegel's view, where the, quote, German world appears superficially to be only a continuation of the Roman, but there lived in it an entirely new spirit through which the world was to be regenerated, the free spirit, which reposes on itself the absolutely self-determination of subjectivity. So all I'm saying right there, I'm not trying to say whether or not, I don't know, Kautsky or Hegel is right, but to rather say that they have kind of a different principle by which they're explaining history. And the reason for this is because there were different tasks bequeathed by history in Kautsky's time and Hegel's time. Meaning for Hegel, that's a transition right there, because it's a transition to a higher stage of self-consciousness. It's the role that Christianity, it's really the role that religion is playing, right? Equality before God, something like this. Whereas Kautsky's history is that he kind of lays out in Forerunners of Modern Socialism. The transition would rather be later, right? So a commercial society brings commodity production, and rather there's a continuation of kind of traditional modes of production. Is that clear to everybody right there? And it's not just that Kautsky is giving an economic history and Hegel's giving like a philosophical one. It's that it's a different problem. And I'll kind of describe what that, yeah.
Could you elaborate on this concept of like being presented with different tasks from history?
Some of this I'm gonna go into, but one way that, what I'm going to be saying, where I said that capital's like an exposition of the materialist conception of history. So what's the slogan? Expropriate the expropriators, seize the means of production. So the separation of production from the producer, right? If you remember back to when we were reading Reform or Revolution a few weeks ago, that's a historical fact. That's not a juridical fact. It's not a legal fact. It's kind of how Luxemburg retorts to Benjamin, meaning it's not that the laws have been written that separate things from people. If that was the case, we would just need better laws, right? But rather it's an expression of what they would say is the growth of the forces of production, new potential that's not grasped by society. And so the reason I say that is because that then projects back upon all of history.
Right.
So history as a relation of humanity, right? It's a relation of current practices to past practices. And I forgot to include this in my presentation, but there's a letter from Marx to Engels right after 1848, where, you know who Lewis Morgan is, everybody? The kind of anthropologist. The Engels text, The Origin of Private Property, the Family and the State. So right after the 1848 revolution, there's like an interest in anthropology. It's a period of counter-revolution, and so people are like, oh, we should go back to like primitive communism, basically, in that sense. And Marx is like, this always happens in any kind of counter-revolutionary period because there's a romantic urge. And so the reason why Marx and Engels take that up is because Lewis Morgan's kind of spontaneous interest in finding socialism in, ancient primitive tribes and also hunter-gatherer tribes that were still contemporary in his time, it's expressing the task of his time. Meaning the problem of the separation of producers from their product is expressing itself in anthropology, it's expressing itself in physics, it's expressing itself in art, it's expressing itself all over. It's the pathology of society. And so the reason why this different history is being drawn is because society is relating to the past in a different way. Hegel, we read the introduction to the philosophy of history, to the lectures in that sense. The task after the French Revolution, the reconciliation of reason and reality, right? That's also the way that Korsch puts it. It's a different task in that sense. And I'll talk a little bit more about it, because the next paragraph I'll talk about a certain problem that comes with the dialectic, which is why I don't want to go down the philosophy route too much, but there becomes a seeming problem, at least with Hegel's dialectic, right? Not the fault of Hegel, but Hegelianism collapses right after Hegel's death into left and right Hegelianism, because it seems like Hegel could potentially become affirmative of capitalism. Obviously, Marx and Engels, they're, to quote Marx, pupils of the mighty thinker, and so they're trying to salvage a part of Hegel, right? Engels just says, we save Hegel from oblivion. So they definitely think of themselves as the heirs to Hegel. So it's not like, is Hegel good or bad? It's how does Hegel become contradictory to the epigones, to the followers, right? As opposed to Hegel himself. But I'll talk about it right. So I have a quote from Lenin. It's always good. As a very young Lenin put it, I think this is the earliest thing I know about him, the gigantic step forward taken by Marx in this respect consisted precisely in that he discarded all these arguments about society and progress in general and produced a scientific analysis of one society and of one progress, capitalist. Meaning Lenin is very clear that when, Marxists say Marx discovered the laws of history under capitalism. This is a very young Engels is just clear as day about that. Right, because history itself becomes a problem under capitalism. Things repeat. I think Marx puts it that in Capital, the 19th century repeats the 16th century. You seem stuck in a time warp, right? All right, I'm going to keep going. I'll put a little detail on sort of what I'm saying. The world became economic. In a letter to Marx, Engels writes that with the Taxious Germans and the American Indians, at this stage, the method of production is less crucial than is the degree to which old blood ties and the ancient mutual community of sexes within the tribe are being dissolved. Meaning, Engels is kind of clear, you can't really describe that period as like a mode of production. And yet, you know, we look at the ancient, you know, hunter-gatherer community, and that's a division of labor right there. You know, we relate to it as, oh, this is their mode of production. It's a kind of division of labor. Women are gathering, men are hunting. The materialist conception of history is the theory of the problem of history under capitalism. The new object created and consciously grasped also plays a role of re-establishing the necessary separation of labor from its product, labor from capital. Capitalist production is centripetal, centralizing, and decentralizing. It seems to re-establish nature at a higher level, the inversion of the purpose of sublation, of Aufhebung. Hence, for Feuerbach, Hegel seems to give an account of, quote, thought surpassing itself in thought, leading to a return of theology out of the criticism of theology. So Marx describes the inversion of the criticism back into theology. This gives rise to a seeming regression from Hegel. Thought seems to fall back into the dualism that was already overcome by radical bourgeois thought. Thus, when Marxists talk about the unifying principle as the growth of the forces of production, this is a way of giving rational form to an estranged dialectic. It is not about posing economics versus philosophy, or materiality versus ideality. When Marx and Engels, following Lewis Morgan, describe history as pottery to domestication to iron smelting, or Marx and the poverty of philosophy, of the hand mill to the steam mill, this is not, quote, technological determinism, as maybe you might get in a class, but a history of commodity fetishism, right? History becomes the history of the means of production confronting people, right? That's why Lewis Morgan is like, oh, it starts with pottery, and then it's domestication of animals, and then it's iron smelting, right? It's the subjectivity of the proletariat is projected back upon history. History hitherto is the history of class struggles. That's a problem to overcome. The accumulation of capital is the growth of the productive forces, but in a strange, distorted manner. By saying that all of history has been one where the productive forces have grown, forming one set of social relations to facilitate the growth of productive forces, only to have those relations cast off when they become fetters, Marx and Engels are saying that all of history is the history of capital, that the means of production have always been separated from the producers. That is why Marx describes Das Kapital as a work of, quote, natural history, meaning bourgeois society imagined itself as coming out of nature, as becoming free, and Marx is throwing it back into nature, right? That's why it's a work of natural history. But also why Franz Mehring had said when Karl Kautsky talks about Das Kapital, he emphasized that it, quote, is in the first place an historical work. Economy is essentially a modern department of learning, writes Balfour Bax. In the ancient world, we have only fitful adumbrations of the conception of such a science. In the Middle Ages proper, as might naturally be expected, no advance is made. Indeed, the idea itself is even lost. Right? So economics is a modern science. So yes, we have Xenophon, but when he says economy, he means the household and how you organize that. I think Rosa Luxemburg has I was going to say a cute text, but it's a great text. But she has cute examples in the text of reading like King Charlemagne and the instructions he gives. And they're like the most simple things in the world. They're like, okay, carry the pottery like this, have barley, great. And she's like, yeah, that really reflects the level of organization. There wasn't fucking derivatives and stuff like that. It was like, yes, that's all you got. So I wanted to describe the very famous passage you've probably heard in several classes, which is Marx's view of history. So this is from the preface to the Contribution to the Critique of Political Economy. Quote, in the social production of their existence, men inevitably enter into definite relations which are independent of their will, namely relations of production appropriate to a given stage in the development of their material forces of production. The totality of these relations of production constitutes the economic structure of society, the real foundation on which arises a legal and political superstructure to which correspond definite forms of social consciousness. The mode of production of material life conditions the general process of social, political, and intellectual life. It is not the consciousness of men that determines their existence, but their social existence that determines their consciousness. The kind of infamous phrase. As Plekhanov notes, when Marx wrote this, quote, he was merely repeating the conclusions that historical science had arrived at before him, under the influence of social development and the class struggle connected with it, right? In other words, a lot of this is actually Marx repeating French materialism. Guizot had already talked about history as the history of class struggles and his formation of the third estate. But Marx gives a kind of historical twist to it. Marx continues, quote, "At a certain stage of development, the material forces of production of society come into conflict with the existing relations of production, or this merely expresses the same thing in legal terms, with the property relations within the framework of which they have operated hitherto. From forms of development of the productive forces, these relations turn into fetters. Then begins an era of social revolution. The changes in the economic foundation lead sooner or later to the transformation of the whole immense superstructure. In studying such transformations, it is always necessary to distinguish between the material transformation of the economic conditions of production, which can be determined with the precision of natural science, legal, political, religious, artistic, or philosophic, in short, ideological forms in which men become conscious of this conflict and fight it out. Just as one does not judge an individual by what he thinks about himself, so one cannot judge such a period of transformation by its consciousness, but on the contrary, this consciousness must be explained from the contradictions of material life, from the conflict existing between the social forces of production and the relations of production." Hegel's philosophy of history contained the immanent motion of idea, of the contradiction between its limitation in order to realize itself, give definite form to itself, and the potential for further development. Hegel would agree that one should not judge the individual by what they think of themselves, but of the contradictions of their time. Caesar is a perfect example of this. So a lot of what Marx is saying, standard bourgeois conception of history. But this misrecognition takes on a certain function in capitalism. So this is where the twist comes in. As Plekhanov says, quote, "If the growing perception that existing social institutions are unreasonable and unjust is itself a consequence of socioeconomic development, it is clear that a certain conformity to law may also be found in the conscious activity of men, which is conditioned by their conceptions of reason and justice. Since this activity is determined in the last analysis by the development of economic relations, now, having ascertained the trend of the economic development of society, we thereby acquire the possibility to foresee in which direction the conscious activity of its members must proceed. In providing the possibility to observe the conscious activity of social man from the point of view of its necessity, the materialist conception of history thus paves the way for socialism on a scientific basis." So just to step back for a second, he's saying, rather than something being wronged, if we recognize that the reason why people feel there's been something unjust is itself the product of the development of potential, that actually gives rise to a different way of observing how people are responding. I'm going to say more about this because it's going to say something about the relationship of socialism and liberalism. Quote, this is not a quote, never mind. "This is the dialectic of freedom and necessity, the possibility of observing purposeful activity from the viewpoint of the necessity giving rise to the impulse. Marxism gave a purpose to purpose. It was bourgeois. Hence, Engels states that, quote, what in economic terms may be formally incorrect, may all the same be correct from the point of view of world history. If mass moral consciousness declares an economic fact to be unjust, as it did at one time in the case of slavery and statutory labor, that is proof that the fact itself has outlived its day, that other economic facts have made their appearance, due to which the former has become unbearable and untenable. Therefore, a very true economic content may be concealed behind the formal economic incorrectness." Lenin loves to quote that passage, by the way. "It is the crisis of bourgeois society that not only is driving the workers to try to put bourgeois society back together, but also is clarifying what is the desiderata of bourgeois society, of what seemed to be the natural justice for the Enlightenment." So you'll hear us a lot of times, maybe sometimes in Platypus, talk about bourgeois desiderata, desires, the ends of bourgeois society. In a sense, they become clarified in the crisis of bourgeois society, because we can see the way in which people who feel wronged are actually trying to put back together a society that itself is in crisis. Not because they're bad, but because actually it feels unjust, right? And socialism is the expression of that. I'll talk a little bit more about that. The ideal that people have, that of socialism, is actually of the completion of bourgeois society. As Marx wrote in his famous letter to Ruga, our program must be the reform of consciousness, not through dogmas, but by analyzing mystical consciousness obscured to itself, whether it appear in religious or political form. It will then become plain that the world has long since dreamed of something of which it needs only to become conscious for it to possess it in reality. It will then become plain that our task is not to draw a sharp mental line between past and future, but to complete the thought of the past. The thought of the past is bourgeois society. Lastly, it will become plain that mankind will not begin any new work, but will consciously bring about the completion of its old work. Or as Marx puts it later in the 1850s, what divides these socialists like Proudhon from bourgeois apologists is, on the one side, their sensitivity to the contradictions included in the system. On the other hand, the utopian inability to grasp the necessary difference between the real and the ideal form of bourgeois society, which is the cause of their desire to undertake the superfluous business of realizing the ideal expression again, which is in fact only the inverted projection of this reality. Meaning Proudhon, socialist, he's saying he's trying to achieve bourgeois society. Or as Engels would write even, I have a gazillion quotes on this. This discovery, which revolutionized the science of history, and as we have seen, is essentially the work of Marx, Engels, the humble guy, a discovery in which I can claim for myself only a very insignificant share, was, however, of immediate importance for the contemporary workers' movement. Communism among the French and Germans, Chartism among the English, now no longer appeared as something accidental which could just as well have not occurred. These movements now presented themselves as a movement of the modern oppressed class, the proletariat, as the more or less developed forms of its historically necessary struggle against the ruling class, the bourgeoisie, as forms of the class struggle, but distinguished from all earlier struggles by one thing, that the present-day oppressed class, the proletariat, cannot achieve its emancipation without at the same time emancipating society as a whole from the division into classes, and therefore from class struggles. And communism now no longer meant the concoction by means of imagination of an ideal society as perfect as possible, but insight into the nature, the conditions, and the consequent general aims of the struggle waged by the proletariat. End of quote. Social being determines consciousness. In other words, social being is bourgeois social being. And it's determining consciousness in its crisis. It's giving rise to the idea of socialism. Right? I'll come back to this a little bit again. Okay, so Marx continues. I'm not going to read through all of the. Any questions so far? Thoughts?
So
Yeah.
you're talking about he was talking about like socioeconomic factors. So how does that play into this? Like you said to complete the thought of the past. That seems very like idealistic to me still.
Oh, I see. Okay, so I guess two things I would say. In other words, we can recognize the conditions that gave rise to the sense of unjustness that are trying to be put right. In other words, the idea behind morality would be a free act, right? I think this is how Kant talks about its principle, is that of freedom. Meaning, when I say, Zeyu, you shouldn't do that, I'm saying, Zeyu, you have the freedom not to, and you choose to anyways because you're incorrigible or something, right? Something like that. But the point being that we can actually recognize what's given rise to what appears like the violation of bourgeois practice, and that there's a kind of, I guess the way they would put it is, it's an unconscious phenomena that can be observed in the same way that nature can. And so that's what allows us to actually grasp bourgeois ideology as an object. Like, you know, in other words, with Adam Smith, it's not bourgeois ideology, at least in the Marxist sense, right? I mean, I guess you could say in the general sense, like he's saying this is how the world ought to be, but it's not in the sense of it being a problem of practice, right? I remember I was on a panel once and someone said, well, like, you know, they were talking about commodity fetishism, and they were like, Adam Smith, it's commodity fetishism. It's not commodity fetishism from Adam Smith. It's commodity fetishism for us, right?
couldn't have been for Smith.
It could. In other words, Smith is saying the world like ought to be commodity production because it like wasn't for the vast majority of things. And so I guess coming back to the completion of the old task, that's a very early insight by Marx that socialism is an expression of the contradiction of society. So earlier in that letter, he says, look, communism is infected by its opposite, private property. Right? Now, if he was Ludwig von Mises, he would just say, ergo, it's dumb, at the end. But, you know, he's a brilliant young Hegelian, so he knows a contradiction means something. And so you don't just say it's contradictory, therefore it's bad. He's like, that's why it's the task, right? That's the insight in that sense. Because, you know, he thinks that humanity is basically setting itself a task of mastering the problem. I talked about the way in which the dialectic starts to become a problem. So capitalism changes to preserve itself, right? You know, it's the line in Capital, the expropriators must be expropriated. Capitalists are expropriated every second, right? Right now, you know, on the stock market, they're expropriating the shit out of each other all today, right? That's what happened. There's a giant drawdown today. Yeah. So capitalism already is the expropriation of property, already is the expropriation of capital. And the problem with that is that it sets up a higher and potentially more opaque version of the problem. So it is a dialectic. It changes to preserve itself. There's a change. There's, you know, quality-quantity dialectic, right? You get to a certain quantitative level. There's a qualitative shock in the technical production. This is why the falling rate of profits talked about all the time. And so, in a sense, communism is actually following through on the negative dialectic. It's trying to make conscious what I was just talking about right now, about how capitalism already is the expropriation of the capitalists by the mass of people coming into the process in a conscious sense, right, and actually organizing that. And that would set up the possibility of a higher potential for emancipation. And so that's why the way in which the task, you know, what Marx is saying is the way in which people are tasking themselves is really the completion of bourgeois society, right? Freedom of each, this kind of thing, from each according to their needs, each according to their ability. That's John Locke, right? John Locke says people will work according to what their needs are. They'll get property according to that, right? It's right there in the second treatise. And so communism is going to achieve that. But in achieving that, you know, the Hegelian moment is that it's going to point beyond it. Right? You realize something by going beyond it. Other thoughts, comments? I'll just keep going.
Well, does that also connect to proletarian revolution as a liquidation of class? It's a self-realization of
Well,
the proletariat.
the point is that the proletarian struggle is constituting class, right? So, like, this is the kind of curious thing, you know, I'll jump around as well because I don't have to say everything, but, you know, when they say all of history is the history of class struggle, it's like, and finally we've gotten to the level where the proletariat is actually producing the conditions of class rather than just it being the subjugation, and that's pointing towards the possibility of overcoming it, right? In other words, who's producing capital? The proletariat, right? The capitalist is capital personified. So they're like producing the condition of their own class oppression. Not like, you know, it's not something that you can individually go and go to work and be like, this is your fault. That's not the point, right? The point is a class, which is a political thing, right, of all society can take responsibility for it. That's the point in that sense. You know, because without the class, then it's just people being, you know, exploited and oppressed because they're in precarious conditions.
Feudalism.
Yeah, you know, like someone was saying that, like, we live in techno-feudalism, and so I don't think we live in feudalism, but I get it,
Yeah.
right? Like, in other words, it does look like that. It's like, yeah, my entire life is like at the mercy of Facebook and Google.
There's also like, I mean, with the like absence of the party, the absence of Marxism, like the world that we receive today is like necessarily like sub 19th century. It
clarity. Yeah, clarity. Yeah, I'll keep going unless we have other thoughts. Okay. Yeah, so when Marx and Engels state the truism that mankind must first of all eat, drink, have shelter and clothing before it can pursue politics, science, art, and religion, they're explaining why people are driven to put bourgeois society back together, even while they tear it apart. In doing so, individuals act in and through bourgeois categories. They politicize political economy. Kautsky saw the role of intellectuals like himself was not to transmit to people the knowledge which they gain in the bourgeois classroom. So he's like, I'm not teaching people, but rather to facilitate the proletariat's scientific understanding of its own position in society. The object of study, writes Kautsky, is the activity of the proletariat itself, its role in the process of production, its role in the class struggle. Only from this activity can the theory, the self-consciousness of the proletariat arise. And just, I want to clarify something. Production, that's not like industrial production. It's even more basic. It's like the Aristotelian principle, the production of forms, of life. So it's everything. It's the production of ideas, religion, philosophy, sciences, the whole thing in that sense. So it's not just like physical entropy in the natural world or something like that. Okay. So, I just wanted to say that Marx continues that no social order has ever been destroyed until all the productive forces, I'm sure we're familiar with the line, and he ends by saying the prehistory of society accordingly closes with this social formation. So I bring that up because the materialist conception of history, the point of that is to overcome that conception of history, right? That in other words, if, when Marx says that our ideas are reflections of circumstances, the materialist conception is a reflection of circumstances. Marxism is. And so to overcome those circumstances would mean to also supersede and overcome the materialist conception of history, right? Meaning the point is not for a future society to be like another set of social relations where the economic forces burst through. That would be a repetition of the problem, right? But rather to overcome that kind of negative dialectic, as I was just saying, of expropriation already happens, but it happens unconsciously, and so it repeats the same kind of problem. Because all, ideas that things can change, that's already there in the bourgeois revolution, right? Thomas Jefferson, the world belongs to the living, Rousseau, right, the general will. It's really by Marx having this history that is itself a kind of evolution, and then calling it all prehistory, right? Because of course, why is it prehistory? Because the beginning of history for mankind will be consciously made. That's kind of the point in that sense. And that's why Lenin says this is a brilliant move, because it's, Marx lays out the progress of one form of society, and it's called capitalism. So to the extent that we don't overcome capitalism, new shit will spring up and stuff like that. Let me see. Okay. Yeah, go ahead.
So, in the absence of that consciousness, for example, today, would we be living in prehistoric times?
Well, one of the impetuses behind this teaching was that I gave some examples of the way in which people think of the materialist conception of history, because I think that the insight into the problem has kind of fallen out. And so it's like, you see that meme where it's like, I'm going to go backwards. It's slave society, feudal society, capitalism, it's like these stages of modes of production.
Right.
And so it's like, right, Marxism is just like economic history.
Yeah.
And so the whole critical aspect of it, I think, has fallen out. And I think that's reflected in the way in which it's taught and kind of understood, even the criticisms of Marxism. In other words, the criticisms of Marxism, maybe they're valid because Marxism is taught in a very one-sided way.
Right.
So people go, well, what about other things? What about ideology? What about fluff? That's totally fair. That makes, all the sense in the world. To continue, in terms of the self-accounts, Franz Mehring noted that, and Franz Mehring, by the way, he was about a generation older than Luxemburg and Karl Liebknecht. He wrote a biography of Karl Marx in 1918, but he was in the Germanist pitting, then later in the Spartacus Bund, so he's kind of older than them, but he's a second international person. The materialist study of history is of course subject to the very laws of historical motion that it lays down. You would have to apply historical materialism to historical materialism. It is the product of historical development. It could not have been imagined in any earlier period by even the most brilliant mind. The secret of the history of mankind could only be unveiled when a certain historical level had been reached. But what did it mean to say that the secret history of mankind was discovered by Marx and Engels? In one of the most popular texts of the Second International, Socialism, Utopian and Scientific, Engels ties the decisive change in the conception of history to the emergence of the class struggle in 1831. Right? So when he says, he reflects on people begin to write histories of the class struggle. Marx and Engels are not the first ones to do this. With the emergence of the class struggle, they start to project back upon all of humanity. Adolf Blanqui, who is the brother of Louis Auguste Blanqui, who's kind of the famous socialist, Marx is friends with him, writes an introduction to a textbook on political economy where he says all of history are like, different property interests fighting it out. And he goes through basically the exact same figures that Marx and Engels use at the beginning of the manifesto. Likewise, there are changes in our conception of nature. So Marx and Engels basically feel like they can explain why there's a Darwin when there's a Darwin, because all of a sudden nature looks like adaptations to different environmental conditions, as if like the animals had their own mode of production, right? So they're kind of like self-conscious of why there's a Darwin, or why there's a Lewis Morgan, as I was giving an example earlier. Marx's materialist conception of history, as he would write in 1877, was not, quote, the universal passport of a general historical philosophical theory, the supreme virtue of which consists in being superhistorical. It is important to note that the forces of production are always outgrowing the relations of production, that we are caught in the kind of hellish repetition of the integument bursting asunder. This is a negative dialectic. The point is to overcome this, and this is why this is not a superhistorical principle. It couldn't be. That's the problem. We're supposed to overcome history as a history of the development of forces of production. Now, Kautsky, I might skip ahead a little bit. Okay, I did have that quote there. I'm going to go to... Okay, bourgeois theorists such as Auguste Thierry had already described the class struggle and its emergence separately from the bourgeois revolutions, but they could not explain why it occurred to them when it did. As Marx would write to Engels, it is strange how this gentleman, the father of the class struggle in French historiography, inveighs in his preface against the moderns, who, while also perceiving the antagonism between bourgeoisie and proletariat, purport to discover traces of such opposition as far back as the history of the Third Estate, prior to 1789. Thierry is at great pains to show that the Third Estate comprises all social ranks and estates, save the noblesse and clergy, and that the bourgeoisie plays the role of the representative of all these other elements. Had Mr. Thierry read our stuff, so here's Marx in a letter to Engels, he's like, you should read our shit, he would know that the decisive opposition between the bourgeoisie and the people does not, of course, crystallize until the former ceases as Third Estate to oppose the clergy and the noblesse. But as for the roots and history of an antagonism born yesterday, his book provides the best proof that the origin of the roots coincided with the origin of the Third Estate. By the same token, the otherwise intelligent critic would have to conclude from the, this is Latin, Senatus Populis Romanes, that in Rome there was never any opposition save between the Senatus and the Populace. So what had happened once the class struggle began to emerge is French historians were at pains to be like, oh, this is like a specific thing, right? So Thierry wants to describe it as something that only emerges kind of after the French Revolution. And Marx and Engels are like, yeah, there's a point to that, right? Because it's in the process of the third estate, all those who work kind of disintegrating. And then there's another person that Marx mentions, this guy Francois Guizot, I'm mispronouncing his name, but I'm sure you can find somebody who can pronounce it well, who basically describes history as the history of different classes duking it out. But he describes it as different societies, so he calls the entire third estate a class, and he calls the first two estates a class, right? So classes are within a society, and he's treating it as different societies. And so you can see the difference in the problem between the bourgeois revolution and the proletarian revolution. Right, the bourgeois revolution, we read, what is the third estate? So the first two estates are outside of society. They're like parasitical, and so you can just remove them.
We talked about this yesterday.
Okay, yeah, go ahead.
It's Luxembourg, when she's comparing the French Revolution, German Revolution in 1848, and the Russian Revolution in 1905. She describes the third estate as outside of.
Right.
It's only a question of the overturning the government.
Right. And that's why it's a mass strike, by the way, in 1905, meaning everybody is part of that. The capitalists are part of the strike. It's democracy. And she says that during 1905, the class struggle comes out in and through the mass strike, right? And it's expressed, for example, the Moscow insurrection. The Soviets are an example of this.
Proletariat takes up the task.
Right, the proletariat takes up, and Lenin knows going into it, as he says, all the liberals are going to show that they're, how does he put it? I don't know why I'm blanking on this. Not ambivalence, not the right word. They're going to like kind of freeze up, right? In other words, they're going to go into it in terms of democracy, and then the class struggle is going to like shock them.
The full development of capitalism.
Inconsistent, that's the term I'm looking for, right? In other words, they're going to be like, we're for democracy, and then democracy is going to come out and they're like, I don't know about that, right? So that's the expression of the class struggle. So, yeah, I already mentioned this quote by Engels. This gives an insight into Kautsky's approach to history. Kautsky's studies into the history of communism, into ancient utopias and the foundation of Christianity were a means of developing class consciousness. He is explaining why such a class could not become self-conscious in the past and how that suggests what is different today. This has clear political implications. What is different is the possibility of the modern proletariat leading society because of the possibility of class consciousness, of grasping why that emerged when it did and what that implies about what would be required to overcome that. Right? This is the materialist conception of history. For example, Kautsky demonstrates the conditions that gave rise to the Hussite communism during the Czech Reformation, or kind of proto-Reformation. As Kautsky puts it, quote, each family worked for itself in its own private house and private field with its own means of production and kept for itself all that was necessary for its own wants. The superfluity alone belonged to the community. This change was not brought about without earnest protest from the more zealous and pronounced faction. Under existing circumstances, communism merely in the articles of consumption was realizable only in the form just mentioned. For this reason, the extremists demanded the introduction of pure communism and the abolition of the family. This is possible in two ways, through celibacy or through the suspension of strict monogamy, i.e. by the so-called community and wives. Right? So in other words, the history that he's giving right there is that like, oh, they could only have communism in terms of like the product because the means of production were only developed to a certain degree then, right? So he's following through on the separation of the means of production and the producer and the present and saying, look, there have always been these different kinds of communism, right? Plato, Thomas More, the Hussite communism, the Taborite communism, you know, Wycliffe, all sorts of different people like that. And yet it was all small production. That's the way that he would put it. He's just using simple terms like that. It wasn't socialized production, right? So one way of describing capitalism, the crisis of industrial forces or socialized production and bourgeois private property, right? Social relations in that sense. So the forces of production outstrip the individual private property, so we relate more socialized than we consciously grasp. That was something I discussed in my first teaching. Whereas those property relations were adequate in the Hussite time, and that's why their communism could only mean like community of wives or like everybody celibate or something like, like some kind of puritanical religious thing. So the cooperative skills of workers had not yet been objectified and estranged from the producer, as detailed in chapters 13 through 15 in Das Kapital. The guilds that existed in the Middle Ages literally owned the skills. That is why they were called mysteries, right? They were passed down, they owned the skills. Seems crazy today, right? What do you mean they own the skills? They fucking owned the skills. They were guilds, and if anybody else used them, they would chop your head off. It was like a mafia, yes. The possibility of socialism in the means of production could not exist, and so therefore communism took on the form of communism of consumption, of a kind of polygamy or asceticism. As he puts it, the Marxist conception of history guards us against the danger of measuring the past with the yardstick of the present, and gives us a keener eye for the peculiar quality of each era and each people. At the same time, it preserves us from the other danger, that of making our description of the past fit the practical interests we are upholding in the present. What mattered was demonstrating the peculiarity of the modern proletariat. And I think, Ethan, you were bringing this up earlier, that's not something that's immediately there. That's an object that literally has to be formed. It's not an immediate, spontaneous object. It's something that people have to actively do. For such historical knowledge helped to constitute the class for itself, for class consciousness is historical consciousness. When this object, the proletarian socialist movement, drops out, the purpose of these historical investigations becomes obscure. So I might get a little polemical for a second. In their introduction to an excerpt of Kautsky's Communism in Central Europe at the time of the Reformation, Jacobin's Lauren Balhorn writes that the book is Kautsky's attempt to reconstruct human history as a history of class struggles in order to imbue his readers with a sense of historical tradition, revolutionary continuity, and moral obligation to the socialist future. Kautsky sees communism historically as developing in two spheres: communism as the intellectual, and communism as the real living struggle of the oppressed and exploited for a better existence. Though it is only under conditions of developed capitalism that a unity of these spheres is possible, realized for Kautsky in the form of the industrial proletariat endowed with social democratic leadership. That does not mean that people throughout history have not already been fighting for a better world. Likewise, in their introduction to the publication of Kautsky's St. Francis of Assisi, cosmonaut Rita Vasquez describes Kautsky's writing as having not just a historical, but a, quote, clear allegorical function, revealed by St. Francis being described as the Jaurès of the 13th century. So Jean Jaurès was a French socialist in the Second International. Allegorical and inspirational confuse, or at least undersell the practice of what Kautsky is doing. So compare how Kautsky speaks of the study of history in the introduction to the foundation of Christianity. I think this is one of my favorite Kautsky quotes. Quote, "The ordinary view looks upon history as a naval chart for mariners on the sea of political action. It should show the reefs and shallows where former seafarers were stranded and enable their successors to get by unscathed. But if the channel of history is constantly changing, and the shallows are always forming in new places, so that every pilot must find his way anew by constantly studying the channel, if mere steering by the old chart only too often leads astray, why still study history, except as a dilettante of antiques? Anyone who took the position would throw out the baby with the bath. To continue the image we have been using, history cannot be used as a permanent chart for the pilot of a political vessel. But that does not signify that it is useless for him. He just has to make a different use of it. He has to use it as a sounding lead, as a means of learning the channel he is in and finding his way in it. The only way to understand a phenomena is to learn how it was formed. I cannot understand today's society if I do not know how it arose, how its various phenomena, capitalism, feudalism, Christianity, Judaism, etc., developed." So why did I start off talking about Rousseau? Returning to the recognition of the state of nature by Rousseau as maybe something that never existed, and yet nonetheless was essential to the nature of things. As a dialectical category, this gives an insight into the approach to, quote, history is the history of class struggles. The materialist conception of history arose with the class struggle out of necessity. History is the relation of present practices to past practices, and the proletariat as a class reproduces a historical contradiction, right? In other words, they're trying to put bourgeois society back together, and they're also trying to burst through bourgeois society at the same way, right? It's a contradiction. For example, Karl Kautsky mentions in his Four Foundations of Christianity that, quote, perhaps it was just my intensive involvement in the class struggle of the proletariat that made it possible for me to get insights into the essence of primitive Christianity that escaped the professors of theology and religious history. Or as Marx put it in 1844, for the socialist man, the entire so-called history of the world is nothing but the creation of man through human labor, nothing but the emergence of nature for man, so he has a visible, irrefutable proof of his birth through himself of his genesis. For Kautsky, the whole point would be the self-reflection of history on itself. In other words, how it's being produced, how that gives an insight into literally the formation of all the phenomena. So in other words, when you read Das Kapital, it's not like here are a bunch of economic categories. What Marx is saying is, why the hell are they there? Why is there a category of money? Why is there a category of labor? Right? He says it right in chapter 6. He goes, oh, everything I was just talking about, they bear the stamp of historical development. Right? In order for there to be wage labor, there has to be money. In order for money to come into existence as a category, you have to have all these, you have to have the division of labor, people have to subsist on production for sale. You have to have a fucking centuries of development. Right? Even the most simple categories are actually expressing a whole infinite development. And in fact, even the simpleness of them, I guess is the best way I would put it, that they seem like pure and out of time, that might express the fullest historical development. Right? They're so simple because it's such an infinite diversity of so many different peculiarities and particularities. Right? Rather than, oh, it's simple because that's the first thing, it might be simple because it's the last thing. So, Kautsky would write later, the only way to know things or phenomena is through their differences. Very Hegelian. What we call properties of a thing are in truth the characteristics that distinguish it from other things. Indeed, a thing in itself can never be known. We can only know each thing or phenomena by comparing it with another phenomena. So in order to understand the capitalist mode of production, we must also compare it with other modes of production. That comparison was already done at its dawn through the contradiction into which it ran with declining feudalism. But we will understand capitalism, its problems and tendencies the better, the greater the number of modes of production we compare it with. Hence, the great interest prevalent in our party for prehistory. He means of all of these different historical examples. You have a question? Okay. Any thoughts so far? I heard something. How much time actually? Because I might jump ahead.
You get an hour and 13.
Hour and 13 in? Okay, so is everybody kind of clear on the history thing in that sense? I was going to say a little bit more about how Kautsky literally projects it all the way into nature. He says that we come out of nature once we start producing the means of production. It's a very kind of self-conscious way of describing the boundary between the human and animal world. And that out of such, we've, basically produced a problem that is calling into question all of civilization, if that makes sense. Meaning, if you're telling me what separates us from the animal world is we produce the means of production, not even tools. He says animals use tools. Right? They're examples of like chimpanzees pick up, they like eat ants with things and stuff like that. Ravens are really smart, stuff like that. But the production of the means of production, so the means to the production of our whole social being, right? Philosophy, education, art, everything like that. He's putting it in a very specific way to say that like all of this is in question unless we realize socialism. That maybe it would be good, that we all went back in the forest and ate acorns instead of, right? Because what did we get in society? wars, genocide, everything like this.
Well, that also is like, that is like political position espoused, like in anarchism still today. I mean, like anarcho-pragmatism, like India comes into question, industrial society and its consequences.
Yeah. Well, but that's why Marxism can explain them, right? They're not saying they're right, they're saying they're symptomatic,
Right. Yeah.
right? In other words, to the degree that we don't achieve socialism, then they're like the bad conscience of society, in that sense, right? Because they'll say, oh yeah, it's like Rousseau makes this point, because people will talk about medicine, and Rousseau will be like, but we also create diseases, and then we create medicine for those diseases. Right? In other words, humanity sets itself its own task, because when you look closer, the problems arise, and it's the Marx way. And so then the question is, what is this all for? For freedom, right? That's where it could be justified, that humanity creates problems for itself as a way of developing further freedom. So I'm going to talk about more the political side of things now. So this is the materialist conception and how the history is kind of informing their politics. So consider the following. We know that labor is the ultimate source of all wealth and culture. Humans have built civilization, have built the world they live in, but the powers of labor can only be facilitated in and through society. People wouldn't be able to activate their full potential in isolation, but would be forced to operate out of basic instinct. Consequently, it follows that we owe to society, which acting in coordination enable us to be beyond mere animals. In the present organization of society, the means to this facilitation are in the hands of a few, despite all of society being involved and assumed in the realization of this potential. This means that society, rather than being the freedom of the worker, is our enslavement. Therefore, the emancipation of labor requires turning those means of production in the hands of the few over to the common, who are actually involved in the realization of labor, who will then be able to work out the correct mode of distribution and production. The Socialist Labor Party is founded on the recognition of this principle, and its purpose is to achieve such. The party may operate at a national level, but the goal is the realization of the common humanity at the international level. The Socialist Labor Party knows that the solution of the labor question cannot be done overnight, and so is a series of demands, including on the present state, with the proviso that they may become democratically controlled, in order to take a step in the right direction. Thus, the Socialist Labor Party has demands within present society, as well as those for the foundation of the state. Sounds good, everybody? I've seen multiple shakes said. So everything I just said was a summary of the Gotha Program, which Karl Marx famously criticized in 1875. So I got you. I got you. The Erfurt Program, which Karl Kautsky has a hand in playing, is pitched in a very different way from the Gotha Program. Written by Kautsky a year after the expiration of the anti-socialist laws, Kautsky published it alongside with the previously withheld critique of the Gotha Program in 1891. Right? In other words, Kautsky, when he's writing this program, is like, okay, we've received Marx's criticism, and we're going to do it better. So they start off differently. All of the struggles of the proletariat are political struggle. They just instantly say that, right? Rather than talking about labor, they're instantly at political struggle. Do you have a question?
No, I was just acknowledging that because you talked about that on your last lecture, and I didn't get to really watch the whole thing too. So
class struggle is political struggle. And this was like this is a line that Marx says in The Poverty of Philosophy. And throughout the entire Second International, Lenin says it, Plekhanov says it, Kautsky says it, everybody's saying it. And it's supposed to be the way in which they're learning from the earlier Gotha conference and the earlier pre-Marxian socialist tendencies, that they're superseding them. I was just thinking about this today because I was thinking about that Lenin dialogue with Kropotkin, so Kropotkin the anarchist, which is the kind of Marxist view, was that it was taking into account all of the concerns of all the preceding socialisms, right? In other words, yes, anarchism wants that emancipation and Marxism's going to achieve it, and Lassalle wants that emancipation, we're also going to realize that, right? They're all one-sided partial symptoms, and Marxism is self-conscious of all of them, and why there are even multiple symptoms, because the situation is contradictory. Okay, so all of the struggles of the proletariat are political. Such a struggle requires political rights, and its ultimate demands require conquering political power as a means to their end. To give this fight a conscious form is the point of the party, and to show the necessary goal. The position of the workers is the same in every country with capitalist production, and the necessity of the revolution grows as the capitalist production spreads across the world, making more nations dependent upon the centers of capital. From this, it follows that the SPD, quote, feels and declares itself to be one with the class-conscious workmen of all other countries. From this, the SPD does not fight to have a new ruling class, but to abolish classes and end, quote, this is in the program, this is in the program, this is in the program. Every kind of exploitation and oppression, whether directed against a class, a party, a sex, or a race. It's in the program. They're fighting all kinds of oppression. Indeed, this was a big defining moment for the socialist movement. The First International had split on the political question. Right? They split at the Hague Congress, right? Because it's put in that the class can only operate as a class. This is the 1872 Congress, in and through a political party. Right? So the anarchists split from the First International over this. As Karl Kautsky would put it in 1909, the liberation of the working class is only possible through the overthrow of private property and the means of production and rulership, and the substitution of social production for production for profit. The proletariat can attain the satisfaction of its wants only in a society whose institutions shall differ fundamentally from the present one. In still another way, the socialists are revolutionary. They recognize that the power of the state is an instrument of class domination, and indeed the most powerful instrument, and that the social revolution for which the proletariat strives cannot be realized until it shall have captured political power. Thus, Kautsky distinguishes Marxism from utopian socialism and Proudhon in that Marx and Engels recognized the need to seize political power, and distinguished from Blanqui that this would have to be done with the class. I think we discussed Blanqui a few weeks ago, whose organization is based on the development of capitalist production, and different from Lassalle in not seeing the state as the end goal. So Kautsky's summarizing all the different ways that Marxism differs from the different movements, and really it's a way in which it combines all of these. Kautsky's The Class Struggle was one of the most popular texts in the Second International. Kautsky is so straightforward in the introduction that it can almost be blinding. The text is, quote, an analysis of present-day society and its development, the objects of the social democracy, the means which are to lead the realization of these objects. But this also separates Kautsky from Marx, and this is kind of one of the points of this teaching. In a sense, Kautsky is the Marxist, right? So Marx is Marx, Kautsky is a Marxist, is the Marxist, because he is the theorist of Marxism as a mass movement. Right? Marx had followers, but he didn't live to see the Erfurt Program. So one of the reasons why the Erfurt Program was such a big moment in the history of Marxism is because it gained hegemony amongst the socialist movement. Right? It's like, okay, now we have an international on Marxism. Right? The leading, Karl Kautsky is the Pope of Marxism. And his mother was called the mother of the Pope of Marxism by the Italians. Okay. Yes, questions? Because I was going to discuss all sorts of different parts of it, but I can jump around. Yeah.
Didn't Engels have a criticism of the Erfurt Program?
Yes. So I didn't mention. Oh, something has to be let in. So Engels' criticism of the Erfurt Program, it's a few things. One, he thinks it's too. Okay, so he thinks it's too wordy. Meaning he says it should be more pithy, and then you can explain things more in details. Meaning, a program's supposed to be a program, it's not supposed to be a theoretical text. There are questions really that come down to the kind of half inclusion regarding the democratic republic. So he's basically like either include it or don't include it, but don't kind of hint at it. So he knows that the reason why they might be shirking from including that is because they just got out of the anti-socialist law. Meaning they just spent 12 years illegal. It was illegal to be a socialist in Germany. And so consequently, they might be like anxious about including such revolutionary language. But then it becomes this question of like, either include it or don't include it. Don't kind of half do it and then kind of confuse people about it. So it's about the language. There's some stuff about trustification as well. There's like some economic criticism, and Engels says, read Marx's Party ouvrier. So Marx had a hand in writing the French program in 1880. And it's around then when he famously says, if that's what Marxism is, I'm not a Marxist, but that gets abused so much, it's obnoxious.
It's a more specific reference.
It's a very specific thing. Like, it's not like he was saying, I don't want Marxists. It's just like, don't fake it, kind of, is the point. It had to do with phrase mongering, as he put it. But yeah, off the top of my head, I should have included something about Engels' criticism, but it's really about the democratic republic and the inclusion about that and the wording of it that the criticism comes down to. The kind of half thing. The ambivalence about it. Yes?
Sort of related to the question that was posed earlier, you mentioned that the significance of the Erfurt program was that it established Marxism as the movement, as the mass movement. And I'm not super familiar with the history of it, but I do wonder if that in any sense represents sort of a liquidation of Marxism into liberalism, or that perhaps it's not directly related to.
I mean, so the issue then becomes, look, everything political always has a risk to it, just period. And, we've been reading on the revisionist dispute, so Lenin and Luxemburg so far. And the problem that crops up, and I was going to talk about Bernstein at the end, is that to grow a Marxist movement, Marxism became part of capitalism. It became a material force as much as, electric telegraphs and anything else. And so therefore it bore the same contradictions as anything else. Now you shouldn't conclude from that, therefore it should never be anything but in the back of some person's mind or something like that. But that's rather why what I was saying in terms of Kautsky as the Marxist or as the theorist of Marxism is he's actually really dealing with the problem that Marx never had to.
Right.
And as I'm going to discuss in my third teaching in terms of Lenin and Luxemburg, they're going to give the Marxist critique of Marxism. Right? In other words, Marxism itself produced new phenomena, one that was hinted at earlier by Lukács, imperialism. Like, this is the point. Like, World War I, it's Marxists vote for that war. It's a split Marxism. Right? And, the reason why I mentioned at the beginning that Karl Kautsky is such a, he's like a controversial figure, but it's not controversial in the way that Lenin is. Lenin is because Lenin posed a question, right, to the rest of the world, right, the revolution. Kautsky is controversial because he betrays the revolution, right, from the Leninist perspective. And so then, people go, as I was just saying earlier in terms of they're plumbers, they can't help but read Kautsky as if the problem's there in 1882, right? It's the text I was about to discuss right now, The Class Struggle, sometimes it's the most difficult text to read with people because every line they're like, oh, this is where he betrays Marxism. And it's no, this is this is 1892. And so what's left out is the development, meaning Karl Kautsky kind of falls to the inertia of the Second International, right? And that's the kind of question we're left with in that sense. It's really the split, the way in which Lenin splits the Second International. It poses a question, it poses a world historical question, right? In other words, Lenin's trying to redeem Marxism, because without that, it would have just been that Marxism organized people for decades to have them run at machine guns to save capitalism. That sucks, right? But, you know what I mean? But also at the same time, we had a great panel in 2012, Ben Lewis and Tom Riley. So Tom Riley of the IBT and Ben Lewis of the CBGBs. Communist Party of Great Britain, IBT is the international Bolshevik tendency. And it was about Lenin and the party. So it's kind of about that pamphlet we read, Lenin and the Vanguard Party. And, Ben Lewis says, well, Lenin takes Karl Kautsky's program, right, kind of the road to power one as I was just using, and that's what he puts into practice in 1917. And Tom Riley kind of has the opposite history, which is that Lenin has like something completely different from Kautsky from the Second Congress onwards, right? A party of the new type. And so it falls out as the dialectic. That, you know, World War I was a crisis of Kautskyism. And Lenin is a student of Kautsky. And he goes beyond Kautsky. He has to negate Kautsky to go beyond Kautsky. But he's still writing in Left-Wing Communism, 1920, how well Kautsky wrote 20 years ago. And as I mentioned earlier, when he writes his Karl Marx Encyclopedia article, this is after Kautsky, you know, the betrayal. He goes, and if you want to learn about capital, go read Kautsky. So then it's like, what does that mean? Right? Because he's like, oh, Karl Kautsky degenerated. He fell to the inertia within the SPD. He basically ends up being an apologist. As, you know, the term was centrist. I mean, Karl Kautsky's not for World War I, but he apologizes for it as a kind of accidental phenomenon. And he actually kind of justifies it on capital. But like what I was about to try to summarize and have a discussion with the class struggle, you could say that everybody in the Third International and all the internationals in the rest of the 20th century, you could say they all agree with it. I mean, it's a fucking great text. I highly recommend it. This is my endorsement, is Karl Kautsky's The Class Struggle. Eugene Debs reads it in prison, he goes, I'm a Marxist. So it's great. Other thoughts? I'm gonna try to like jump around and summarize it. Okay. So, part one, so it has 5 sections. Part one begins with the kind of Das Kapital sort of economic development of the modes of production. He begins with small production, and he starts off with, you know, kind of a standard, even Smithian development that we have, kind of handicraft, household production, and trade begins to develop things, begins to encourage people to produce for trade. And we know there's a change already right there, meaning the second that that happens, people begin to be more speculative, right? So Arnold Hauser, in his Social History of Art, you know, he links up certain moments in art history to the emergence of commerce. And he has a very Marxist history, he's a Marxist, that's why. And the second that that happens, that people begin to not just produce for their direct needs in their household, and when I say household, I mean it's like 20 families in a house. It's a lot of families in a household. It's you know, one of these paterfamilia kind of situations. That the second that that happens, that encourages people to instantly think out of their immediate life world condition, because then you're thinking, what's at the market? And it's literally cultivating this sort of speculative faculty within people. So he talks about you know, small production falling away, but I actually think Eugene Debs puts it pretty well in 1900. Debs says, a century ago work was done by hand very largely, or with simple primitive tools. In that day, the working man owned and controlled the tools with which he worked and was virtually his own employer. It was then the machine emanated from the brain of labor. It was designed to aid the laboring man so that he could provide for his social, moral, and intellectual improvement. At this point, an industrial revolution began. The machine, the new tool of production, passed from the control of the working man, who used it, into that of the newly developed class. The small employer became a capitalist, and the employed became a wage worker, and they began to grow apart. And so Debs continues to say how the machine brings in women and children, and you know, he basically says that this industrial revolution kind of went on behind the backs of people. So it's Debs kind of summarizing something from Engels. In other words, the Industrial Revolution is first looked at as a kind of quantitative thing. Like, oh, you just have a machine, now we produce more shit, that's good, I guess. But they're saying, no, it's a revolution. Like, it qualitatively changed things, but we continue to operate in terms of small production.
And boy, I mean, it also produces discontents, like the Luddites and, you know, people who are excluded.
Exactly, and that's a good point. You know, it's a point that Kautsky brings up later in the text. So, in order for machines to be applied, there had to already have been development in terms of civil society and property relations. Meaning, the ribbon loom is invented by this guy Müller. It's German, in the early 16th century. And the second he invents it, he's drowned. right? People kill him because they know that that's going to disrupt the order of things. So there were several times in which there were inventions in the early 16th century, early 17th century, and unfortunately the inventors are like chased away and killed. So sure, right, like all sorts of things like that. And so the application of machinery already presupposes a certain development that actually allows for people to kind of dispense with their property as they would, right? And in that sense, it presupposes small production. Because small production, it's like, oh, I got a hammer? I'm going to use a hammer. That's my right. And so, oh, now I have a machine. I'm going to use the machine as I want. Right? It already presupposes a certain independence of production. And so that's why it develops out of that in that sense. So what is unfashionable about Kautsky's text might be how it is presented. He speaks of small and large property. It seems kind of, unsophisticated and profane. Right? He's like, oh, small and large. Okay, great. The common criticism of the Second International is that they seem to have affirmed labor by treating industrial production as merely progressive and emphasizing the contradiction of capitalism as one of markets, right? But Kautsky is working through the forms of appearance that were live in that period, meaning Kautsky is writing in the 1880s, 1890s. The forms of capitalism as they're taking place in a lot of Europe are recently proletarianized peasants. And so the live form is the destruction of small property and people being forced into a factory, becoming a wage laborer, this kind of industrialization. That phenomenological form is how capitalism is expressing itself, and that's the way that Kautsky is going. If we think back to the materialist conception, a quote I skipped over earlier is that Kautsky was very interested in Christianity because one of the rival opposing parties in Germany was the Catholic Center Party. And so who's going to organize the Catholic workers? Or not even Catholic workers, just the Catholics, right? Are they going to be a force of reaction? No, so therefore he has to reach into the entire history of Christianity and say, oh, the first rebellion? It's Christianity, right? It's an immanent dialectical critique. He's saying, no, if you want to redeem Christianity, you got to be with socialism, right? Okay. So, right. So then he continues in chapter 2, and he talks about the old conditions passing away absolutely. When the New Left took issue with what they saw as the market-based explanation of capitalist production, we have to remember that they did so under the historical condition of the Cold War's dualism of official communism and U.S. post-war prosperity. The discontents of the New Left were different than those of the Second International. Kautsky's account is more live and therefore more imminent, more Marxist for his time. He shows how, quote, buying and selling became a business, emerging with the advances in farming technique and giving rise to a merchant class. Whereas this development was originally for a family satisfying its own needs, it had created the possibility for subsistence through purchasing. Thus, the first capital began as merchants' capital. But as the world market extended, the handicrafts that merchants bought from were unable to satisfy the rapidly increasing demands of the market. This causes the merchants to convert into manufacturers, to internalize production with exchange, and revolutionize the productive processes in order to meet the demands of the new commercial society. Kautsky is clearly not romantic about labor. Quote, at the stage of economic development now under discussion, the income of the craftsman or laborer depends somewhat on his industry and skill, but it can never go beyond a fixed limit. That of the tradesman, however, is determined only by the amount of his capital. The possibilities of labor are limited, those of capital are unlimited. Again, this is the most well-read text in the Second International, right? And he's clear, like, yes, we experience it as oppression, but it could be reappropriated as unlimited freedom. Okay, so consequently he goes on into part 2 and 3 on the proletariat and capitalist classes. I'm going to try to jump around because I'm doing a little strange task right here. While the proletariat came into existence through forcible means, the economic power of the system has become sufficient to accomplish the desired result without breaking the law of private property. So it is true, yes, peasants were thrown off the land, there were violent enclosures, but this transformed things. There's always been conquering and stuff, has always existed, but this was concomitant with the transformation in organization of society, such that people are now regulated by private property. This means the critique of categories becomes required to break with the problem reproduced. Following Kautsky's principle about historical critique, this helps to explain what happened that brought the modern laborer into existence. The small farmer, the artisan, the small producers generally, were the owners of the product of their labor by reason of their ownership of the means of production. As Marx put it in Capital, Volume 1, manufacture is characterized by the differentiation of the instruments of labor, a differentiation whereby implements of a given sort acquire fixed shapes adapted to each particular application, and by the specialization of those instruments, giving to each special implement its full play only in the hands of a specific detail laborer. In Birmingham, alone 500 varieties of hammers are produced. And not only is each adapted to one particular process, but several varieties often serve exclusively for the different operations in one and the same process. The manufacturing period simplifies, improves, and multiplies the implements of labor by adapting them to the exclusively special functions of each detail laborer. In other words, in Smith's time, the principle of the development of production was labor's own engagement with the object. So Adam Smith, first line of Wealth of Nations. The productive powers of the labor are the wealth of nations. That's the principle, right? After the Industrial Revolution, the principle becomes the general intellect, this kind of very general term. It's the full historical development of all of the science, technology, all the labor, all the machines, all of everything, all the philosophy, all the mathematics. It's just the full social powers of society. That becomes the principle, right? And that's why the workers phenomenologically turn into appendages, as Marx kind of talks about. So, yes. And so what machines are expressing then, it's not that people thought up implements, but they're expressed in a kind of estranged form of the general intellect of society. Social being determines consciousness. Right? So it confronts us as the property of others, but really it's a rational form of the socialization of society, or maybe an irrational form is more what I meant. Right? It kind of misdirects our ability to practically grasp the powers of society. Is that clear? Not clear? I'm trying to read everybody's countenance. So, Kautsky adds, he continues that there's always been wage workers. At one time the capitalists were fellow workers. A little quote by Revisionist. But something that's been kind of new is while there's always been different forms of capital, meaning merchants would buy to sell dear, there was usury, right? I know you've all read The Merchant of Venice, all sorts of things like that. What's new, as Kautsky puts it, he calls it the youngest sibling of capital, is industrial capital. So, but being that merchant and commercial capital are of the same family, it follows that although the several functions of the capitalist thus become the functions of separate undertakings, they do not become independent of each other in appearance and legal form. Economically, they remain as closely bound to and dependent upon each other as ever. The entire apparatus is a delicate machine. The appearance of capitalism as a product of political rights or laws must be inverted. The laws are only the smooth lubrication that was brought forth by the needs of the political system. So what Kautsky is saying right here is that, I'll give you an example. In the economy, we might have different sectors. We have the financial sector, we have the industrial sector, right? And they look like they're individual undertakings. So what Marx had shown in Capital and what Kautsky is relaying here is that actually they're all one delicate mechanism, right? When we think about it today, we might think of Wall Street versus like industrial production, like people producing things, or Bed Bath & Beyond versus Wall Street, like that's another example I like to give a lot. right? Commercial capital versus finance. The whole point is that that's a necessary form of misrecognition, that actually it's all socialized, but it relates as individual proprietors. Or another way to think about this is Adam Smith talks about the butcher and the baker, and that made sense. It literally was like a butcher and a baker, and they had different tools, and they're independent businesses. They were cooperative in the sense that they presuppose selling, I don't know what the butcher would sell, venison? Meat. Venison. I'm gonna say venison. Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, so I mean, I kind of struggled with that distinction because, like, when we read the 1844 manuscripts or Lukács, I think it's pretty evident, like, how we're alienated from like industrial production and commercial production because people are actually like working and they're separated from means of production. But it's less clear to me how we're alienated from financial capital.
I'll give you an example. So this is in the news right now, the trucker convoy. So a lot of the left has been like, oh, they're not workers because they own their means of production, because they own the trucks. So this is an example of bad Marxism, right? In other words, what's meant by means of production there is they literally take the immediate like tool and they're like, that's means of production. The reason why you got the separation of the means of production from the producers is an expression of the socialization of production that's, in a sense, happened behind the backs of the way in which we relate. So in terms of, I'll have a second example for how finance is alienated in a second, but the point is that in order to hire one single person at Bed Bath & Beyond, whose name is maybe Danny Jacobs at one time, you have to actually have capital advance from the financial sector. You have to have equity, you have to have loans to start a new business. I might as well give my example. So Shark Tank.
Yeah.
Okay, so if I pulled Adam Smith from the grave and he saw Shark Tank, he'd be horrified. Horrified, right? Because not only did he rail against mercantile profit, but he would be like, oh, this is the exact, like, collapse of entrepreneurship.
It's capitalists competing for capital.
It's capitalists, it's small capitalists, competing for larger capitalists to give them capital so that they can be capitalists. Right? So in other words, yes, like the way that Marx presents it in the 1844 manuscripts, because he's working through kind of quasi-philosophical political economic categories, it kind of like is immediate in a certain way, or it's easy to think about. But the point is that your estranged labor is actually like all of the financing that goes into all of the capital that is then confronting you as the cash register and the licensing and the logistical chain and all of the advertising and branding and all the inventory and all of the insurance and right to even hire you as like someone folding towels on the soft side of Bed Bath & Beyond requires all of these different operations going into it, right? Because it's presupposing the licensing, it's presupposing the mass production of the vacuum cleaner maker that's selling to both Target, Bed Bath & Beyond, and Kmart. It's presupposing all the logistical chains. It's presupposing all the financing, which is getting a cut, right? It's getting interest on the loans, or the equity that's been raised. Right, that they're constantly, Bed Bath & Beyond's a public, I don't know why I'm railing against them, but it's just like, what my point being, that, what?
It's
just an example, it's just that estranged labor is like, it's actually beyond, in a sense, what we can even grasp right now. Mm-hmm. And that's why the whole point of socialism is to make that tractable, so that one could even begin to engage with it. I think actually, okay, so I think Tony actually mentioned this at one time, which is that like in a socialist society, people would be able to be dialectical in a real sense, right? Because we would actually be able to practically, tractably engage with society as a whole. And that's not just the civil sphere, meaning, the point I made in my first teaching is that when Marx says when right meets right, force decides, is that the entire political apparatus is part of the estranged labor, meaning there's a political presupposition that goes into the conditions of wage labor. Let me give an example about that, which is that, you know the phrase, the personal is political? Okay, so that came up in the New Left because the idea of having one breadwinner and then having your spouse at home, okay, so having the woman at home and the man working just because of the gender or whatever, all these things like that, that was politically presupposed as part of the agreement of labor and capital post-war. And so why was the personal political? Because the domestic conditions were part of the conditions of labor. Because all of the, you know, the taxation rate, that it was like a period of low equities and high bonds, and that they had a high income rate that nobody paid really, even though it's kind of a liberal like trope to bring it up, even though nobody paid it, the whole thing like that. The estranged labor is the entirety of all those conditions that go into even something straightforward. So it's not like you go to the Bed Bath & Beyond, you don't own the cash, you know, the cash register that you operate at. That's like a minuscule part of the whole thing. In that sense. I don't know, did that help, Connor? I know you had another question.
Yeah, I mean, I get, so I guess it's impossible for it to even be conscious, like how we create finance capital as a society to dominate us. Is that what you're kind of alluding to?
I mean, so I guess I'll talk a little, I can talk a little bit about like the emergence of, because the way that Marx develops finance capital in volume 3 is that it's coming out of the overproduction of capital. And the money form of the overproduction of capital is put in banks. And so banking really becomes like a major thing in the 19th century. Central banks do. And the superfluity of capital, not only does it have to be managed, but it's literally creating a kind of like crisis in the money supply, right? So we're dealing with inflation right now. Okay, so that also encourages over speculation in equities, right? Because if you're expecting money to depreciate, then the worst thing in the world is putting money under your bed and losing value on it. And so to preserve the money value, you want to put it into the stock market, which, you know, if you did the last 2 months sucked. So, you know what I mean? Like, in other words, it's literally the overproduction of capital is expressing itself in a crisis in money, right? And I mean, the other thing to get as well, I'm going back to the social being determines consciousness, the way in which we understand capitalism, we understand it through the absurdity in bourgeois forms, right? So unemployment is an example of something that, for Adam Smith, as I was just saying, wouldn't really make sense. Not that people couldn't lose their jobs and go and work elsewhere, but permanent unemployment, right? It would be like, for Adam Smith, he's like, but the whole wealth of nations is labor.
Right.
So what do you mean we can't put those people to work? Right? Like it's like Adam Smith is almost like the humanist par excellence. He's like, the more people, the better. People are great. You know, he says the prosperity is like, oh, people are having more children. It's beautiful. It's a wonderful thing. We're gonna have more Benjamin Franklins. It's great. You know, he's like the people liker. Whereas today we have like, you know, once a year we have, like, you know, you go to some family reunion and they're like, oh, there's too many people. Like you start to hear this shit. That's a symptom of capitalism. It's not that we literally have too many people. It's that the system has this absurdity where it's like, oh, we have all the people we need.
Yeah.
Right? Does that help?
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, because the reason I also say that is because it's kind of absurd to say there's too much money, right? If there's too much money, you put it on your bed. So why do we experience too much money? Because we experience overinvestment.
Right.
And why do we have overinvestment? I was going to talk about the falling rate of profit, you know, this kind of infamous thing in Marxism next. It's the capitalists, the anarchy of production is driving the capitalists who themselves are already more interdependent than they can grasp to invest more and more and more.
Yeah.
Right? I mean, there's a lot of reasons we had inflation last year. I mean, there's logistical chain stuff. There's part of the transfers. There's, just quantitative easing out the wazoo and everything like that. But there's also just like speculation all over the place, right? Like every single thing related to mRNA vaccines, people were like, throw $1 gazillion at it, right? And in a free society, that would be wonderful if we put resources into that, but we experience it as a crisis, right? That's the absurdity of it. Because I'm not saying don't, create new mRNA vaccines. That's not my point. So, just to say in terms of the falling rate of profit, because this has been the kind of big thing about the millennials have been into the falling rate of profit. So here's Kautsky in The Class Struggle. This is great. Some there are who have concluded from the sinking of profits that the capitalist system of exploitation will put an end to itself, that capital will eventually yield so little profit that starvation will force the capitalist to look for work. This conclusion would be correct if, as the rate of profit sank, the quantity of invested capital remained the same. This, however, is by no means the case. The decline of profit and interest does not bring on the downfall, but the narrowing of the capitalist class. You remember how I said earlier, capital is always being expropriated? The falling rate of profit is bigger capitals expropriating smaller capitals. They buy them out, right? There's a liquidation of assets all the time. Every year, small capitalists are expelled from it and consigned to the same death struggle in which the small dealer, the small producer, the small farmer, the small concerns generally are engaged. A death struggle that may be more or less protracted, but which will finally end for them or for their children with the downfall into the proletariat. Their efforts to escape their fate only hasten their ruining. So the expropriation is always happening in that sense. The reason why it was a big thing for Marx is because the falling rate of profit for Smith was the facilitation of production. So a high rate of profit for Adam Smith meant there was a monopoly, right? Like, Adam Smith, when he's talking about the East India Trading Company, he says, well, the reason they have that high profit rate is because they're hampering the markets, right? And so they're getting a profit rate above what they ought to get. And in a free society, they would have to actually compete, and they would have to take that profit and reinvest it into workers, right? So a falling rate of profit for Adam Smith is good. Imagine that today, like when we hear falling rate of profit, that's like a fucking problem, right? It's like, oh, there's no earnings, and PE ratios are too high, this is bad, kind of thing like that, right? Whereas for Adam Smith, he'd be like, yeah, falling rate of profit, right? You're gonna hire more workers, they're gonna get higher wages, better technology, and it's also, because he's a Rousseauian, it would align the businesses with the general interest of society. So he has the kind of Rousseauian thing that really when they're getting high profit, they're ripping off, the rest of society in that sense. Whereas, okay, if they're going to do their business and they're going to have that private interest, then it must be regulated for the most amount of people, right? Like Adam Smith is a humanist, sociable person. That's what it's a political economy. This is how the world ought to be. So Kautsky moves on to the political program, and I thought this is also worth talking about. Any thoughts or comments so far? Okay. I mean, Kautsky also has a great line where he says, on the basis of private property, we destroy private property. Right, again, private property is the form that the socialization of production takes on, is it looks like it's like somebody else. Now, Connor brought up the 1844 manuscripts earlier. Marx is dealing with, as he puts it, how it appears. He says real man. So he doesn't yet have quite the way in which the whole process happens. He doesn't, it's a manuscript. He's like writing to himself. He's trying to clarify, why is it that communism has emerged at all? Why is it that there's a proletariat? What does this mean? What is kind of the contradiction? He's still working things out for himself. So Kautsky moves on to the political program and the point of a socialist party. When we speak of the irresistible and inevitable nature of the social revolution, writes Kautsky, we presuppose that men are men and not puppets, that they are beings endowed with certain wants and impulses, with certain physical and mental powers, which they will seek to use in their own interest. when we declare the abolition of private property and the means of production to be unavoidable, we do not mean that some fine morning the exploited classes will find that, without their help, some good fairy has brought about the revolution. We consider the breakdown of the present social system to be unavoidable because we know that the economic evolution inevitably brings on conditions that will compel the exploited classes to rise against the system of ownership, right? In other words, when they say revolution is inevitable, they mean that people will try to change things. And so if we go back to this question of the negative dialectic, revolution is part of capitalism, right? In other words, you can bring everybody out to smash up all of the capitalist stores and everything like that, and that can just lay the foundation for more capitalism. Go ahead, yeah.
What I wanted to ask, so I wish you was here, but yesterday at our reading group, we were talking about the reconstitution of things in the capital. And part of it was we had someone who had come and said, well, why is the revolution necessary? Like there are other ways to overcome capitalism. What he brought up was 100% inheritance tax.
Okay.
And it's like, well, then you have 100% inheritance tax, so you don't have the accumulation of capital. So, it's like, why is that?
Well, I mean, it would just accumulate the capital elsewhere, right? So it would keep the property relations as is in that sense. So, yeah, so it's not like the revolution is, the Marxists never said we're calling for the revolution, and said it was going to happen anyways.
Yeah.
So this is, by the way, Lenin's point in October of 1917. So he's saying the peasants are already uprising, and there's already mutinies in Germany, and there's already the instability of the Kerensky government. This is going to happen anyways. And he says, it's either going to be us or it's going to be Kornilov. Right, Kornilov was a general. Yeah, it's just going to be a reactionary, it's going to be like fascism early in Russia then in that sense. So, the question in terms of revolution and capitalism is that capitalism's the revolution and counter-revolution at the same time, right? It's a kind of like runaway train. It's a contradictory process. Things have to change. All that's holy is profane. All that's solid melts to air.
Self-revolution, I think.
It is self-revolution. Yeah, it's the bourgeoisie can't help but revolutionize things. So the question is rather, how does one make that conscious so that it's not an infinite repetition until the sun explodes and then there was no point, right? Right? How does one grasp the historical process instead of being subject to it in that sense? So when Kautsky says this, it's like, why do we need a socialist party? We need a socialist party because people are going to try to change things anyways. And it's either going to be socialism or it's going to be like reactionary crazy shit, right? It's going to be fascism. And
Which it was.
which it absolutely can become. So, the point of the Socialist Party is to go into the revolution being conscious of the problem. And that's why I mentioned the materialist conception of history. In other words, knowing that the same conditions which lay the possibility for socialism could be the possibility for more capitalism. Right? So when we say, for example, socialism is a reflection of the conditions of society, that means it bears the same contradictions as capitalism. That's what Marx is saying in the letter to Ruga. He's saying, communism is infected by its opposite, private property. It's a dogmatic conception, right? And so, in that sense, it's posing the problem, and it thus has the possibility of becoming self-conscious, but it also bears with it what's already happening, meaning capitalism is already socializing property, it's already eating up small producers, it's already expropriating them. It's like, the libertarians will say like, the communists are against private property. No, Marx's point is, no, capitalism destroying private property every 5 seconds. Yes, that's the point, right? It's not one or the other in that sense. It's rather, is this going to be, did humanity create a higher form of nature that's going to oppress it? Or is this the next stage in human emancipation?
Yeah, you take hold of it.
Right, exactly. Right, revolutions prepare themselves by years or decades of economic and political struggle, writes Kautsky. They're accomplished amidst constant ups and downs sustained by conflicting classes and parties. Not infrequently, they are interrupted by long periods of reaction. The party prepares for its revolutionary patience, but it does not make the revolution. The problem with reforms for Kautsky is that they propose to remove the growing contradictions while striving to uphold and confirm the system of property. So 100%, abolish, or what was this, inheritance tax or something, upholds this relations of property. Yeah. And it might even make things more opaque in a sense, because then it's like, today it would just go into the tax, tax revenue of like Biden's administration. That's not gonna like.
You don't want to say
It's gonna pay down like interest on the debt. Like that's not gonna fucking help or something like that. It's gonna go into the military or something. For Kautsky, it is not that one should not try to ameliorate the conditions, right? Like workers, I'm totally for them getting higher wages, all sorts of things, right? Like it's just another person in society. It's a good liberal, you can be for that. But the reforms could lead workers to, quote, shut their eyes to the economic development of the last century. The laws to reform capitalism gave a new impulse to the economic development, transforming the contradiction and often making it worse. Striking workers were replaced with machines. This may make the goal of a socialist party seem futile, but as Kautsky tells us, the same economic development that forces on us the question, what shall we put in the place of the system of private ownership and the means of production, brings with it the condition that answers the question. The new system of property lies latent in the old. Right? Why is that? Private property in the instruments of production has its root in small production. Individual production makes individual ownership necessary. Large production, on the contrary, means cooperation, social production. In large production, the individual does not work alone, but a large number of workers, the whole commonwealth, work together to produce a whole. So there's a great line in the manifesto where Marx and Engels say, in the last instance, capital requires the cooperation of all of society together. That's why I was saying even, me as a cashier at Bed Bath & Beyond, actually it's the cooperation of all of capital. So all the licensing, all the insurance, all the financing, all of it all together to give me that menial job that made me hate my life. So, right? Like, this is my point, that obviously this is not sufficient for the actual capabilities that we could do in society. Okay. It has become wholly impossible that every single worker should own his own instruments of production. Once the present stage is reached by large production, it admits of but two systems of ownership. First, private ownership by the individual in the means of production used by cooperative labor. That means the existing system of capitalist production, with its train of misery and exploitation, as the portion of the workers in suffocating abundance, as the portion of the will finally end for them or for their children. Wait, I said this wrong. Hold on. Suffocating abundance as the portion of the capitalists. Second, ownership by the workers in common of the instruments of production. That means a cooperative system of production and the extinction of the exploitation of the workers, who become masters of their own products and who themselves appropriate the surplus of which, under our system, they are deprived by the capitalists. So Kautsky is clear here that small and large is not the quantitative amount of capital, but it's historical moments, meaning small production is really bourgeois society, right? When Thomas Jefferson writes like Notes on Virginia, that's really like pre-capitalism in a lot of ways. And that's why, right after, I'll actually just say something about Thomas Jefferson for a second. Right after the American Revolution, Thomas Jefferson goes to Europe, and he writes this letter where he's like, he calls it a fire engine, and a steam engine, and he's like, what the hell is that? Right? He's like, they got this thing here in England, it's like crazy. And he's like, we don't need that in the United States, right? Because basically people are like individual proprietors. And then later, by the end of his life, Thomas Jefferson is like, oh, okay, we might actually need machinery now because they were starting to experience, the emergence of industrial production. And then in the last year of Thomas Jefferson's life, he hears about utopian socialism, right? He gets a letter from Francis Wright, who's inviting him to one of these Robert Owen socialist communes. And Jefferson says, it's a little morbid. He goes, I have one leg in the grave already. Like, I'm an old man. And he goes, but my greatest regret in life is that I did not leave to see the abolition of slavery, right? And so Thomas Jefferson says, maybe these utopian socialists, Cabet and Robert Owen, and he met Robert Owen, maybe their socialist communes will actually free and emancipate the man of color. Right, so it's a letter from Francis Wright, a year before Thomas Jefferson died. So in other words, Thomas Jefferson is literally living through what Marx is talking about in Das Kapital of the proletarianization, and he's kind of changing his mind on things. Right, he changes his mind on other things as well, but that's besides it. So let me just keep going then. The two systems of ownership are different ways of utilizing the socialized form of production. There is an interrelationship between socialist and capitalist production. The difference being expressed here as ownership is the conscious form given to the potential. This is so stunningly clear that it is painful for us to read today. Is this a return to an older form of society with new technology? No, socialism, quote, will not be the sequel to ancient communism. It will be the sequel to the capitalist system of production, which itself develops the elements that are requisite for the organization of its successor. It brings forth the new people whom the new system of production needs. So also capitalism is forming people in a certain way. You know, it's a point that Marx makes all the time where he's like, even things that are like just barbarism, just advertising, right? Things like that. Even that is an expression of possibility for self-regulation, right? Like, okay, yeah, if we got, if we got those jingles that are like in the back of my head all day, like we got rid of that, then maybe advertising is a form of information sharing. I don't know, or Marx calls it a form of civilizing in the Grundrisse. So just to continue, for example, ancient Rome had similar forms of primitive accumulation, but only, quote, modern capitalism creates the basis for rising above the bloody destruction, while ancient capitalism could not. The ancient forms only destroyed and did not open up the possibility for the construction of a new and higher mode of production, because what was driving the uprooting of peasants was not the transformation into a new mode of organization, but was literally the activity of the Roman ruling class, meaning they just wanted more slaves, right, in that sense. They weren't like sending they weren't, what is it? There was a famous phrase about sheep-eating men, that peasants were kicked off the land to turn it into sheep walks for commodities in that sense. Whereas, in Rome, they were just like getting more people to demonstrate their decadence and luxury, and so that they didn't have to work in that sense. So I'm going to bring up a panel that we did. Mike McNair from the Communist Party of Great Britain, who has been part of the influence in reviving the neo-Kautskyism of the millennials, said on a platypus panel in 2015 that it was a mistake to identify capitalism with unemployment and machinery. So, quote, the Earl of Shaftesbury, the first opposition leader in 1679 to 1683, fled abroad to the Netherlands. Before he died, he said, I have 10,000 brisk boys from Bermondsey who will back me up in the struggle against the monarchy. These brisk boys were London dockers. On the same panel, he says, there was unemployment produced by technical innovations in 17th century England. In fact, both unemployment and the need to produce unemployment protection systems appeared as early as the Italian city-states. Wind machines and water machines are just as capable of being improved in order to reduce labor as steamships are. They're less spectacular than steamships, but they're the same thing, capital. There is capitalism along feudal continuity. It's not that there was a period of petty commodity production and then capitalism grew up subsequently out of petty commodity production. Right, so this is what Mike McNair said, it was a democracy on the left panel. But it is not exploited workers, mechanical devices, or unemployment that defined capitalism. For example, John Bellers, as Kautsky notes, had already proposed a social welfare system in 1695 to take some of the excesses of industrial production. Over a century later, socialists proposed communes that were, quote, 10 times larger than those proposed by Bellers, such as Fourier's phalansteries or the Robert Owen communes I was just talking about. In the interim century, machine production emerged and posed an entirely different problem and solution. Quote, the machine was restlessly revolutionizing social life. It had expanded capitalist undertakings to such an extent that some of them already embraced whole nations in their operations. It had brought the several undertakings of the country into greater dependence upon one another, so that they virtually constituted one industry, and it constantly tended to turn the whole economic life of capitalist nations into a single economic mechanism. The unemployment was not ultimately due to technical innovation, which renders this accidental based on the emergence of such innovation, right? That's why I brought up the ribbon loom earlier. But was an expression of the interdependence that had been facilitated by bourgeois relations, but went beyond them, right? So this is why I was saying that machine application presupposes bourgeois relations, but it's a force that, to quote Marx, bursts the entugment of bourgeois social relations. It actually socializes it beyond what they can capture. And that's why we get the famous base superstructure thing. That thought form is an expression of contradiction, right? Going back to what I was saying earlier about the materialist conception of history. The point is to overcome that. And it's not like, oh, that's what humanity is. The point is to overcome that. But even more importantly, this would seem to imply that state interference is the opposite of capitalism. Kautsky had to deal with something very similar to us in his day. Quote, the hostility of the capitalist class to the interference of the state in the economic life of the country came to the surface first in England, where it received the name of the Manchester School. The doctrines of that school were the first weapons with which the capitalist class took the field against the socialist labor movement. It is no wonder that the opinion took hold of many a socialist working man that a supporter of the Manchester School and a capitalist were one and the same thing, and that on the other hand, socialism and the interference of the state in the economic affairs of the country were identical. No wonder that such working men believed that to overthrow the Manchester School was to overthrow capitalism itself. Nothing less true, right? In other words, this was a common kind of thought. This is 1892. It's like, oh yeah, capitalism means the market, and socialism means like, yeah, the state interference. It's like, no, capitalism's the destruction of the market, right? And the state steps in out of necessity so that society, to quote Lenin, doesn't eat itself, basically, right? Okay, so continue. Any thoughts so far? Maybe I'll jump around a little bit. I'll talk about women since...
So, why does this conception persist? Like, the identity of capitalism.
Yeah, I mean, going back to this, the forms by which the oppression takes, so the socialization of production takes the form of an employer, right, versus the employees, right? So like it takes the form of the CEO and the will of them. Marx calls the capitalist the personification of capital. But in fact, production is way more socialized than them. We hear this in the, like, capitalist politicians kind of say it now and then. You know, they'll say you didn't build that.
Yeah.
But they then keep it within the business.
Right.
Right? They say, no, you're dependent upon your workers. And it's like, no, Marx's point is actually your property is all of society's property.
Built that.
Yeah, which almost seems weird. Like, even me saying it right now, it's like, what do you mean, like, everybody owns it? No.
I mean, if you pull it all the way back, like, yeah.
That's no, the point is actually, like,
Yeah.
all of society already is in. I mean, this is what Kautsky is saying in 1892. He goes, oh, in fact, entire nations are part of
Right.
one single economic mechanism. That makes sense. So it continues to subsist. I mean, one, capitalism is always destroying itself. And so things repeat, because in a sense things get, you know, rebuilt under changed conditions, and so things return in that sense. And so that's why you get like neoliberalism, get neo-Marxism,
Yeah.
You know,
Neo-libertarian.
neo-libertarianism, yeah, right, in that sense. You know, because he says a little bit later, actually, coming down then, if there is a party, this implies there must be a program explaining the society you want. Socialists are, accordingly, told that they must come out with a plan of a future state. If they refuse, it is a sign that they themselves have not much confidence in it. Right? Like, oh, you want socialism? Tell me how it's going to work. But modern society has necessitated the study of evolution. Quote, the adversaries of socialism have not gone beyond the standpoint occupied by the social science of 100 years ago, where the modern bourgeois institutions were treated by the utopian socialists as having, quote, sprung from the brains of the philosophers of the previous century. The materialist conception of history implies that the transformation of production will also be met with new forms of thought. This is what Marx and Engels called scientific socialism. The utopian socialists, while they knew what changed from the 18th century, could not explain where the idea of communism came from. So Robert Owen says, we don't live in Adam Smith's time, but all of the legislators act as if that's the case.
Yeah.
Right? So they go, the reason the institutions are bad is because we have like dumb legislators. Right? And I have a better idea, it's called socialism. And Marx and Engels are saying, no, the reason why socialism emerged to you when it did is as an expression of the contradiction of society with itself. Right? As we were just saying, literally the socialization of production, but mediated through individual private property, that contradiction gives rise to the idea of socialism. Right? It actually gives rise to it maybe even through an ancient idea, because people kind of think in an inverted way. So to quote Engels, modern socialism is, in its essence, the direct product of the recognition on the one hand of the class antagonisms existing in the society of today between proprietors and non-proprietors, between capitalists and wage workers, on the other hand of the anarchy existing in production. But in its theoretical form, modern socialism originally appears ostensibly as a more logical extension of the principles laid down by the great French philosophers of the 18th century. Like every new theory, modern socialism had at first to connect itself with the intellectual stock in trade ready to its hand, however deeply its roots lay in material economic facts. Meaning socialism kind of starts off as like, oh, it's Babeuf, right? It's like the French Revolution, or it's like Thomas Paine, or it's Thomas Jefferson. It's just kind of like following the principles. I think in the Holy Family, Marx says there's a straight line from John Locke to socialism. Right, so from the arch-bourgeois, private property, labor, English Revolution. Yeah, if you follow that consistently, it's like, oh, isn't that factory the labor of the people?
Well, we talk about like Marxism as like the highest expression of that.
Of bourgeois consciousness,
Yeah,
but the highest because it's self-aware of why it appears like that, right? So social being determines consciousness. That's appearing when it does because society is literally contradictory, and this is the kind of ideological form. Likewise, just to reference two other famous texts during the Second International, so Clara Zetkin, so International Women's Day, she's the person who started that holiday. It's a revolutionary socialist holiday. She, in a 1896 speech she gave, said, it was only the capitalist mode of production which created the societal transformation that brought forth the modern women's question by destroying the old family economic system, which provided both livelihood and life's meaning for the great mass of women during the pre-capitalistic period. So the women's question for Zetkin and Kautsky is a modern question. So Zetkin says in the speech, there couldn't have been a women's question prior. No doubt women were exploited, oppressed, all sorts of the worst infamies ever. But relating women qua woman, right? Like a women's question is an expression of industrial production.
That's also like the Jean Devilliers text of
Yes.
Capitalism and Gay Identity.
Capitalism and gay identity.
There's a separation between like homosexual action and the question of gayness.
Sexuality as a civil society interest, right? So there's always been all the sexual practices that you think you're really cool doing, they've already existed, right, millennia ago. But it becomes a kind of question because the crisis of society is expressing itself in different forms of oppression. So who were the first, industrial workers? Women, right? And that's why industrial labor was considered effeminate, right? And then all of a sudden, as Engels details in the condition of the working class of England, he's like walking around the East End in London and he's like, oh, there's like an 8-year-old girl kicking her parents out of her house because she's the wage worker. And she's like, oh, you guys haven't worked? I own this house now, right? And so what's a reaction to that? Oh, well, the women's proper place is in the home, right? These are reactions to capitalism in that sense. And that's why August Bebel, so there was another famous text in the Second International called Women in Socialism. And August Bebel was the first politician publicly to defend homosexuality as well, in the Reichstag as well. But in Women in Socialism, he writes, our goal then is not only to achieve equality of men and women under the present social order, which constitutes the sole aim of the bourgeois women's movement, but to go far beyond this and to remove all barriers that make one human being dependent upon another, which includes the dependence of one sex upon the other. The solution of the women's question is identical with the solution of the social question. They also seek a complete solution of the women's question, must therefore join hands with those who have inscribed upon their banner the solution of the social question in the interest of all mankind, the Socialists. The Socialist Party is the only one that has made the full equality of women, their liberation from every form of dependence and oppression, an integral part of its program, not for reasons of propaganda, but from necessity. It's right there in the manifesto, right? The freedom of each is the condition for the freedom of all, right? Pache, whatever myths you heard about, socialism with sexism or socialism with racism. No, there's no socialism without the emancipation of all.
Yeah.
Period. Just fucking period. For there can be no liberation of mankind without social independence and equality of the sexes. That's Bebel, Women of Socialism, right in the introduction. So why is the women's question showing up with the emergence of machinery? Because machinery is presupposing women and children. Meaning machinery is allowing for the undercutting of the skilled labor which tended to be men in that sense. And so it's actually presupposing that someone has no background at all. And so really one of the driving forces of the Industrial Revolution is women and children. Right.
Women, in fact, they were the first workers.
It probably existed before most of the machines, meaning the machines are arising in order to employ these children and women in that sense. And that this is also behind why there's a modern educational system. Meaning, why do we get public education? Because parents don't want their children competing with them. But the children become investments for future labor. So all of society is being brought into this question in that sense. And either you're going to let it run unconsciously or you're going to take it up consciously in that sense. So, I don't know, conservatives say like socialists are destroying the family, and like the point is capitalism did it. Were you going to say something? Sorry.
Oh, no, I'm just saying.
Oh, I thought you were like, hell yeah.
I was like, no, I was saying that because when I first heard that point, that capitalism was destroying the family, I thought it was a big deal to me. Like I remember hearing that, and I was like, wow, they're right. But now I kind of realize it's not true.
Yeah. I'm going to jump to Bernstein, because I don't know how much time we have left. I can see people are putting jackets on and stuff as if they're about to jump out the window, so I might as well.
It's just cold. But
No,
if we could wrap it up.
How much time do I have left?
You can take whatever.
You can take as much time. It's 9:30.
Okay. I wanted to talk about Bernstein because I think that Bernstein is an example of I'll skip some of the biographical aspect, the point being that Edward Bernstein, the arch revisionist, right? Like, okay, revisionist Marxism, Edward Bernstein is, I am a revisionist Marxist, like directly. That's the entire point behind evolutionary socialism. That Kautsky and Bernstein, when they were kind of more in their youth, they were, to quote Kautsky, brother in arms, right? And they were considered like the revolutionaries. So they got in trouble for even being too firebrand. They were writing too revolutionary language, and it was scaring some of the more conservative parts of Germany. And they also made a name, both of them, as being like, very skilled readers of Marx's Capital. In fact, that's literally why they were becoming famous, is they were like, they got it, and they could argue with people in public. And this is kind of how they got some of their early fame in that sense. So I thought I would kind of read through some of Bernstein's criticisms of Marx, because I think the criticism brings out it actually helps to highlight Marx's point in its criticism. I mean, and it's kind of clever in that sense, and so it actually brings out some of the more esoteric points exactly where he's kind of flattening things in a certain way. So, shit, I was going to say this. What the fuck is this? Sorry. Okay, I'll just read this. Yeah, so there's something I want to clarify about Bernstein's rejection of Marx's critique of political economy. He sees his substitution of the theory of marginal utility for that of the labor theory of value as the necessary conclusion of something that Marx had already proven. So, I mean, people are aware of, like, marginal utility. I'll just give a little background. In other words, there's sometimes the most controversial part about Marxism is this kind of idea about the labor theory of value, right? That Marx is saying that all value is labor, which is not what he says, but it doesn't matter because that's what people ascribe to him. And so consequently, modern economics has what it tends to call a marginal utility theory or subjective theory of value, meaning they understand classical political economy by saying that prices are determined by the amount of labor applied. This is what they say. This is not what I'm saying either Adam Smith or Marx is saying. And that really prices are determined on the margin. So people kind of demand on the margin a unit, and that altogether is kind of determining the price on the market. So as I talked about in my first teach-in, labor as value is really kind of the war cry of the bourgeois revolution. The way that Rosa Luxemburg put it is the artisans in the cities put the property of labor against the property of land. So property and land was like the landlords, the feudal lords, the people who had conquered, and then they would pass it down in terms of primogeniture. Bourgeois society is a society that the first property is on labor. So the labor theory of value is really the Lockean kind of homesteading, that you should get what you work for, which is the most commonsensical ethic that everybody, if you walk down the street right now, would agree with, because they all experience it. Like, yeah, that's my wage, I want my money, right? That's a modern conception, actually, that you should get what you work for, because that was not the case in, like, as I was talking about ancient Rome. No, the people who didn't work should get what you did because they conquered you, and that's it, right? And if you say anything else, they'll chop your head off, right? That was that ethic. So in capitalism, bourgeois social relations, as I was mentioning, I can feel the tension in the room, so I'm going to try to run through this, and I'm going to explain all of this in that sense. Okay, so Bernstein, is it recording now? Okay, so Bernstein famously kind of rejects the labor theory of value, but he actually thinks that Karl Marx already proves that it's really the marginal utility theory is the one that is appropriate for explaining the world. And there's a kernel of truth to this. There's a kernel of truth to this because, as I was just saying, bourgeois social relations become anachronistic. We were just reading Kautsky on small property. And so the fact that labor as value seems to not make sense anymore really expresses, in a sense, the way in which a lot of people experience things, right? I mean, I think the way that Marx puts it in Capital is, if I told you that that phone right there, is an expression of labor, like the universal equivalent of labor, he would say the absurdity is self-evident, because we know all the technology and everything else that's not labor, right? It's not skilled labor, has gone into that. And yet we continue to relate in society on these kind of bourgeois social relations on the small property. So this is Bernstein, and I'm going to talk about this. Feel free to ask a billion questions while I'm talking. Bernstein says, in modern society, according to Marx, the value of commodities consists in the socially necessary labor spent on them measured according to time. But with the analysis of this measure of value, quite a series of abstractions and reductions is necessary. As is known, Friedrich Engels, in an essay left behind him, which was published in the Newszeit of the year 1895-1896, it's one of the last things Engels writes, pointed out a solution of the problem through the historical consideration of the process. Accordingly, the law of value was of a directly determining power. It directly governed the exchange of commodities in the period of exchange and barter of commodities preceding the capitalist order of society. Yes, that's the point. Yeah, okay, yes, because prior to capitalist society was emerging bourgeois society.
Right.
Engels seeks to prove this in connection with a passage in the third volume of Capital by a short description of the historic evolution of economics, right? So I mentioned economics as a new thing. But although he presents the rise and development of the rate of profit so brilliantly, the essay fails in convicting strength of proof just where it deals with the question of value. According to Engels' representation of the Marxist law of value, ruled generally as an economic law from 5,000 to 7,000 years from the beginning of exchange products as commodities in Babylon, Egypt, up to the beginning of the era of capitalist production. Okay. Here Bernstein is saying that according to Marxist theory of value, it basically ruled up until capitalism in that sense. There's of course a truth to this. Bourgeois social relations, those based on the exchange of equal labor, have grown anachronistic. The contradiction of forces of production and relations of production is a contradiction of industrial potential set in motion by a set of social relations, labor, that it undermines and therefore doesn't realize. Bernstein is picking up on this and overemphasizing one side of that critique, right? He's kind of flattening it in a sense. That labor has become anachronistic. So Bernstein continues, but what was at those times clearer than today is the fact of surplus labor. Surplus labor has always existed. Right? We're just talking about ancient Rome, ancient Greece, ancient whatever, all based on surplus labor. When surplus labor was performed in ancient times, and in the Middle Ages no kind of deception prevailed about it, it was not hidden by any conception of value. When the slave had to produce for exchange, he was a simple surplus labor machine. The serf and the bondsman performed surplus labor in the open form of compulsory service. The journeyman employed by the guildmaster could easily see what his work cost his master and how much he reckoned it to the customer. This clearness of the relations between wages of labor and prices of commodities prevails even on the threshold of the capitalist period. From it are explained many passages that surprise us today in the economic writings of that time about surplus labor and labor as the sole producer of wealth. What appears to us the result of a deeper observation of things was at that time almost a commonplace, right? In other words, if you read John Locke, he says, oh, where does all wealth come from? It's labor. He's like, obviously, what the fuck else is there? It's only, it's like, what does he say? Labor's the father and nature's the mother. That's it. You can't say it's like thermodynamics imply, or like fucking using the cloud at AWS or something like that. Of course not. The theory arising at the beginning of the manufacturing period of labor as the measure of exchange value, the latter conception then first becoming general, certainly starts from the conception of labor as the only parent of wealth and interprets value still quite concretely as the cost price of commodity, but forthwith contributes more towards confusing the conceptions of surplus labor than of clearing them. We can learn from Marx himself how Adam Smith, on the basis of these conceptions, represented profits and ground rent as deductions from the labor value, right? So Adam Smith says, yeah, there's rent, there's profit, and there's wages, but they're all labor. And Marx and Engels call him the Martin Luther of political economy exactly for that statement. How Ricardo worked out this thought more fully and how socialists turned it against bourgeois economy, right? So the labor theory of value becomes contentious in a way that for Adam Smith, he's arguing the world ought to be like this. The socialist turned around to say, that's why we ought to own the factory, because it's labor. And the capitalist says, no, that's my property. It's my labor. When right meets right, force decides. But with Adam Smith, labor value is already conceived as an abstraction from the prevailing reality. His full reality is in, quote, the early and crude state of society, which precedes the accumulation of capital and the appropriation of land and in backward industries. In the capitalist world, on the other hand, profit and rent are for Smith's constituent elements of value besides labor or wages, and labor value serves Smith only as a concept to disclose the division of products of labor, that is, the fact of surplus labor. In the Marxist system, it is not otherwise than in principle. Marx certainly sticks to the idea of labor value more firmly than Smith, and has conceived it in a more strict but at the same time also more abstract form. But whilst the Marxist school and the present author amongst them believed that a point of fundamental importance for the system was the passionately discussed question as to whether the attribute of, quote, socially necessary labor time and labor value related only to the manner of the production of the respective commodities, or included also the relation of the amount produced of these commodities to effective demand, a solution lay already in the desk of Marx which gave quite a different complexion to this and other questions, forced it into another region on the other plane. The value of individual commodities or kinds of commodities becomes something quite secondary since they are sold at the price of their production, cost of production plus profit rate. So just to step back for a second, Edward Bernstein, who apparently doesn't know anything about capital, is now bringing up very esoteric details in chapters 9 and 10 of volume 3 of Capital. And as a good reader of Marx's Capital, or at least clever reader, because he is flattening it in a certain way to make a point, he's saying, well, you know, individual commodities are not regulated by labor. Yes, right? In fact, he's saying, Marx seems to be saying kind of nothing is really regulated at the end of the day by labor, in a way, but that it only shows itself, as he's going to continue, at the total level of production, right? And this is where it's going to get to a way of, Edward Bernstein is right, but for the wrong reason. He kind of says the wrong thing. What takes the first place is the value of the total production of society. From this point of view, the value of every single kind of commodity is determined by the labor time which was necessary to produce it under normal conditions of production, to that amount which the market, that is the community as purchasers, can take in each case. Now, just for the commodities under consideration, there is in reality no exact measure of the need of the community at a given moment, and this value conceived as above is a purely abstract entity, not otherwise than the value of the final utility of the school of Goss and Jevons and Bohm-Bark. Actual relations lie at the foundation of both, but both are built up on abstractions. In other words, this is me, it's just Danny Jacobs, Bernstein is saying that only in the present has labor as the basis of wealth come to be challenged. What is interesting, and it is maybe a point that Bernstein draws which means something different than what he intended, was that he explains marginal utility as a sort of natural conclusion to Marx's exposition that labor only regulates at the total social level. So in the late 19th century, in the 1870s, there's something called the marginal revolution, right? There's this revolution in economics that value is subjective and it's on the margin in this case. And, you know, for Edward Bernstein, he's like, we need to update Marxism with the latest science. But we've just been discussing about how bourgeois social relations are anachronistic. And so it makes sense that there's this revolution in the late 19th century called the marginal revolution that kind of dismisses bourgeois society. Right? In other words, it's the symptomatic expression of the disintegration of bourgeois society, that it really doesn't seem to be regulated by bourgeois social relations. And Bernstein emphasizes at the total level. Right, so when do bourgeois social relations show themselves, really? In collapses of society, right? In the fact that all of a sudden we have too many houses in 2008 so that people can no longer live in houses, right? So I think this was a question earlier about like, how do we understand capitalism? We understand it in the absurdities of bourgeois forms, right? Overproduction of workers with idle machinery, right? Like, oh, put them, you know. I think Adorno has this thing about like a child just like sometimes is clearer about things. And like children would be like, oh, you have unemployed people? You have machines? Put them to work, you know, like what the hell's happening or something like that. Whereas adults grown up would be like, well, that wouldn't be profitable. You know, who's the absurd one there, right? Like, you know, in other words, people have adapted too much to the crisis of bourgeois society. So, what I think is kind of telling about Bernstein is the way in which he captures one side of Marx's critique, because Marx is saying that labor is anachronistic, but the way to overcome it is it's not going to spontaneously happen on its own. And in that sense, Bernstein is capitulating and falling to the immediate appearance of capitalism. Social being determines consciousness, right? In other words, he's saying it doesn't seem like things are regulated by labor at the immediate moment, right? So he's kind of superficially dealing with things. As Marx puts it in the Fetishism of Commodities, when I state that coats or boots stand in a relation to linen because it is the universal incarnation of abstract human labor, the absurdity of the statement is self-evident. There's something absurd to saying labor regulates things. That's Karl Marx. Nevertheless, when the producers of coats and boots compare those articles with linen, or what is the same thing with gold or silver, as the universal equivalent, they express the relation between their own private labor and the collective labor of society in the same absurd form. The categories of bourgeois economy consist of such like forms. They are forms of thought expressing with social validity the conditions and relations of a definite, historically determined mode of production, the production of commodities, right? Commodity production, bourgeois society. The whole mystery of commodities, all the magic and necromancy that surrounds the products of labor as long as they take the form of commodities, vanishes, therefore, so soon as we come to other forms of production, right? So, Marx then continues to talk about past things. But can you guys bear with me while I read one more page? I know you guys are reaching it, okay? Because I think Friedrich Engels is going to say it even better, right? Because he's just going to put it right on the notes, okay? Engels, too, had noted that contemporary political economy adapted uncritically and without examining their content the economic categories labor, capital, and value. As he wrote in a preface to Marx's Poverty of Philosophy, this was posthumously, the above application of the Ricardian theory that the entire social product belongs to the workers as their product because they are the sole real producers leads directly to communism, right? So bourgeois political economy leads directly to communism. But as Marx indeed indicates, it is incorrect in formal economic terms, for it is simply an application of morality to economics. According to the laws of bourgeois economics, the greatest part of the product does not belong to the workers who have produced it. If we now say that is unjust, that ought not to be so, then that has nothing immediately to do with economics. We are merely saying that it is an economic fact, is in contradiction to our sense of morality. This is important. Marx therefore never based his communist demands upon this, but upon the inevitable collapse of the capitalist mode of production, which is daily taking place before our eyes, to an ever-growing degree. He says only the surplus value consists of unpaid labor, which is a simple fact. But what in economic terms may be formally incorrect, may all the same be correct from the point of world history. If mass moral consciousness declares an economic fact to be unjust, as it did at one time in the case of slavery and statute labor, that is proof that the fact itself has outlived its day, that other economic facts have made their appearance due to which the former has become unbearable and untenable. Therefore, very true economic content may be concealed behind the formal economic incorrectness. This is not the place to deal with it more quickly, okay? At the same time, other conclusions can be drawn and have been drawn from the Ricardian theory of value. The value of commodities is determined by the labor required for the production. But now it turns out that in this imperfect world of commodities are sold sometimes above and sometimes below their value, and indeed not only as a result of ups and downs in competition. But the Ricardian definition of value, in spite of its characteristics, has a feature which makes it dear to the heart of the honest bourgeois. It appeals with irresistible force to his sense of justice. Justice and equality of rights are the cornerstones to which the bourgeois of the 18th and 19th centuries would like to erect his social edifice over the ruins of feudal injustice, inequality, and privilege. And the determination of value of commodities by labor and the free exchange of the products of labor, taking place according to the measure of value between commodity owners with equal rights, these are, as Marx has already proved, the real foundations on which the whole political, juridical, philosophical ideology of the modern bourgeoisie has been built. Just to stop for a second, meaning there's an entire social practice behind the famous French slogan of fraternity, equality, liberty. Right? Or the American life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. These are all expressions of actually the social practice, right? Including even pursuit of happiness, meaning the becoming of society, right? That happiness could change what makes things happy. And so likewise, people might be wrong economically, but they're picking up on the contradiction of social being and possibility, right? They're picking up on the fact that how we relate in society is not according to the desiderata of the relations, right? That we undermine the equality of bourgeois social relations that they were founded upon. And so this goes back to the question of communism as realizing the desiderata, the ideology of bourgeois society, because it's compelling people in its crisis out of a sense of injustice to try to right such. And of course, socialism will follow through on that promise, and even more in that sense. So, I guess I'll stop there. I mean, I have other things, but I wrote too much in that sense. But I guess the big thing from this second part of the syllabus I would try to have as a takeaway then is rather that, the Second International approached capital as a conception of history. The conception of history informed their politics in that sense. Obviously we can't use the Gotha Program today, right? That's not the point. I'm not saying like this is the program or something like that, but just to get people to consider the problem of history. That's all. Like I would be just happy with that in that sense. And that maybe also if you go on your own and you start reading Capital, that you would approach it as, Mayring said about Kautsky, it's a historical text through and through in that sense. So I'll have the third teaching about Lenin and Luxemburg's kind of imminent critique of Kautsky, and then I'll disintegrate. Sounds okay.
On that happy
Ash.
Yeah.
Alright, I guess.
Yes.